There is a short scene near the end of an early episode of Rick and Morty where Morty stands in a dim upstairs hallway, talks his sister out of running away from home, and tells her, almost cheerfully, that nobody exists on purpose, nobody belongs anywhere, everybody is going to die, and the best thing to do is come downstairs and watch television. He has just helped his grandfather bury their own corpses in the backyard. He delivers the line the way a person delivers good news. Tonight on Recast, we're going through the nihilism of Rick and Morty in full, the buried bodies, the Wubba Lubba Dub Dub, the Cronenbergs, Unity, the Citadel, the wife, the original Morty, the recast, all of it. Every angle and every layer, the show has spent more than a decade folding in on itself. So get comfortable, turn the lights down, we will be here a while. And if you have not subscribed yet, it really does help us keep making these. To talk about the nihilism of Rick and Morty properly, you have to start with the fact that the show announced itself in its very first episode. The pilot aired on Adult Swim in late 2013, a half-hour cartoon that opened with a drunk grandfather pulling his 14-year-old grandson out of bed in the middle of the night and informing him that he is going on an adventure that will probably kill them both. Within the first few minutes, you have a half-confessed plan to blow up the human race and restart civilization with the boy and a girl that the grandfather casually plans to abduct from school. The show puts that idea in front of you, and then it just keeps moving. The joke is not the plan. The joke is that the grandfather has already lost interest in the plan by the next scene. He has cosmic intelligence, infinite worlds at his disposal, technology that can fold the laws of physics like a napkin, and he is bored by his own apocalypse. That is the thesis of the show in compressed form. The universe is infinite. Meaning is a small flickering candle, and the smartest person in the room can already see straight through it. Everything that comes after, the multiverse, the Citadel, the wife, evil Morty, the 70+ episodes of accumulated bleak comedy, all of it grows out of that opening hour, a show announcing itself as a comedy about a man who has already done the philosophy and lost. Nihilism is one of those words that gets thrown around with very little precision. In philosophy, in the strictest sense, it is the position that nothing has inherent value or meaning, that moral truths are not woven into the fabric of the universe, that purpose and significance are projections of the human mind onto a cosmos that does not actually care. Rick and Morty is not a philosophy seminar. It is a cartoon written by people who clearly read enough Nietzsche and Camus and Sartre to be dangerous. And the way the show wields nihilism is rarely academic. It works in mood. It works in implication. It works in the timing of a punchline that lands a half beat after the genuine horror underneath it. The show will spend an entire episode building a vivid emotional crisis, the kind of beat a more conventional family sitcom would resolve through a hug and a lesson, and then it will simply refuse to resolve. It will cut to black on the actual pain. It will let the credits run over a quiet, devastating image. And then the next episode will open with a fart joke about a sentient turd, because the show is committed to the idea that there is no special preserve for meaning. Tragedy and slapstick share the same room and the same air, and neither one is allowed to claim the moral high ground. This is what makes the show genuinely useful as a sleep companion. Oddly enough, because the thing your brain wants at the edge of sleep is not to be hyped, not to be flattered, not to be lied to. It wants someone to talk it down off the day. And Rick and Morty, in its own way, talks you down off the entire enterprise of caring too much about anything at all. The argument the show has been making for over a decade is that the cosmos is infinite, that infinity dilutes everything, that you and your specific life are statistically rounding errors against an unspooling field of every other possible version of you, and that the only sane response is to keep showing up to dinner anyway. Read this way. The show is not nihilist in the sense of telling you that nothing matters. It is nihilist in the sense that it strips meaning back to its actual weight-bearing parts. It clears the table of pretty lies and asks what, if anything, is still standing once the lies are gone. And what is left standing, almost always, is a tired family in a house in suburban Washington state, eating pasta, watching cartoons, trying to make it through the night. To understand how the show gets to that position, you have to understand the original sin of the series, the moment that everything else hangs from, and that moment happens in the 6th episode of season 1. The episode is the one fans simply call the Cronenberg episode. The premise, as set up, is comic and small. Rick brews a love potion for Morty to use on a girl at the school dance. The potion gets out, mutates, and infects every human on Earth, turning them all into oozing flesh monsters. Rick tries to fix it. The fix fails. He tries again. The fix fails worse. Eventually he decides, in the middle of the catastrophe, that the simplest solution is to find an alternate version of Earth on which his other self has just successfully fixed everything, but where, conveniently, the alternate Rick and the alternate Morty have just died in a freak lab accident. He pops over with the Morty he came in with, drags the corpses of their parallel selves into the garden, and digs 2 graves. Morty stands there with a shovel, trembling, watching himself go into the ground, and the show lets that beat land. The visual is genuinely horrifying. The boy burying his own face. Rick tells him to get over it, that the only difference between this version of his family and the original version is a slightly different last 20 minutes of biographical detail, that everyone in the house is going to wake up tomorrow and not be able to tell the difference. Morty has to sit at the dinner table and listen to a mother and father who are not his and eat the pasta they made and pretend. That sequence is, in a real sense, the moment the show stops being a Doctor Who parody and becomes Rick and Morty. Before that, it was inventive, it was loud, it was riffing on every science fiction template available. After that, every joke has a small dark room in the back of it. The show suggests, in the way only animation can suggest, that this kind of substitution is happening constantly off camera. The point underneath the joke is that if you can swap entire planets and nobody can tell, then meaning was never tethered to the specific atoms of a specific world. The show does not say that out loud. It does not need to. It just plays the dinner scene and lets you live with it. And then in episode 8, only 2 episodes later, Morty stands at the top of the stairs holding the line, "Nobody exists on purpose, nobody belongs anywhere, everybody's going to die. Come watch television." He has been carrying the buried bodies in his head for 2 weeks of viewer time. He has not told his sister. He is not going to. He is just going to weaponize what he learned to keep her from running away. That is what nihilism looks like inside a 14-year-old. It is not a philosophy. It is a small, cold gift. You give the person you love so they will stop crying. There is a temptation, when you start writing about the nihilism of Rick and Morty, to treat it as cynical, as cool, as a kind of edgy posture the show has put on to look sophisticated. That reading is not quite fair to the show. From the very beginning, the show has framed its nihilism as a wound, not a flex. The smartest person in any of the infinite rooms is the one in the worst shape. Rick is constantly drunk. Rick is constantly self-medicating. Rick will not let anyone, including himself, sit still long enough for an actual feeling to land. The pilot episode does not present any of this as aspirational. It presents it as a kind of haunted, brilliant, exhausted state of being, the resting heart rate of a man who has run out of reasons. The show says, here is someone who has done the thinking, and look at what it did to him. Look at the smell of him. Look at the people who have to live with him. This is what it costs to see clearly. Are you sure you still want to? That is where the show parks itself for the first 2 seasons, in a kind of grim playground in which the philosophical horror is always there, but the family is still mostly intact and the camera mostly stays in suburban Washington. Beth, the daughter, is a horse surgeon whose entire personality has been organized around the absence of her father. Jerry, the son-in-law, is a man whose entire personality has been organized around being told he is mediocre. Summer, the older grandchild, is a teenager mostly trying to be cool in a house in which 2 of her 3 blood relatives are wandering geniuses, and one of them is her grandfather. And Morty, the youngest, is the actual viewpoint of the series, a kid whose nervous system is being slowly recalibrated by repeated exposure to infinite cosmic horror. He stutters, he flinches, he cries, he grows quieter, episode by episode. He learns to bury himself, he learns to lie to his sister, he learns eventually to say sentences like the one at the top of the stairs without his voice cracking. This is the slow argument the show makes about meaninglessness, that the actual texture of nihilism is not a debate in a lecture hall, it is what happens to a kid who has been dragged through too many universes too young. Watch the early seasons in order, and you can almost track the calibration. In the first episode, Morty is wide-eyed. By the 6th, he is digging a grave. By the 8th, he is the one delivering the dark wisdom. By the end of the first season, He has watched his grandfather lock a hyper-intelligent dog civilization in a separate dimension, watched his father almost get sold to aliens, and helped his grandfather defeat an interdimensional council of his own copies. He is not yet broken. He is being broken in. The show is rehearsing him. And the show is rehearsing you because the viewer is doing the same calibration, becoming slowly more comfortable with images that, in the very first episode, the cartoon would have treated as unthinkable. By the end of season 1, fans were laughing at jokes about world-ending atrocities the way you laugh at running gags. That is not an accident. That is the show training your tolerance, the same way Rick is training Morty's. Nihilism, in this version, is a kind of acclimatization. You get used to the cold by being left out in it long enough. One of the cleanest, most quietly devastating arguments the show makes about meaninglessness comes through a character that, on the surface, looks like a one-off joke. Mr. Meeseeks. The premise is delivered like a sitcom gag. Rick hands the family a small blue box. You press the button on top. A blue humanoid creature with a high voice and a manic helpfulness pops into existence. You give it one task, it helps you, and then it vanishes. The trick is in the rule Rick almost mumbles past as he is leaving. Meeseeks are not really alive in the way you are. Existence is pain to a Meeseeks, and the only thing that ends their pain is the completion of their assigned task. They want, more than anything, not to be. The episode plays this for laughs at first. Beth uses her Meeseeks to feel like a more complete woman, and the Meeseeks works on her in a brief, gentle session and then vanishes, satisfied. Summer uses her Meeseeks to be more popular at school, and the Meeseeks handles it off-screen and disappears. The system works. Then Jerry asks his Meeseeks to take 2 strokes off his golf game, and the Meeseeks cannot do it. He tries, he fails. He summons another Meeseeks to help. That second Meeseeks summons a third. The pile of Meeseeks grows. Each one keeps tally of how long it has been alive past the moment it was supposed to die. Each one is in a quietly escalating panic about still existing. By the third act, dozens of Meeseeks are storming a steakhouse, threatening to kill an oblivious customer if it will end their existence, and Jerry is still standing there, explaining that he just wanted his golf swing fixed. The episode treats it as farce, the way Rick and Morty treats almost everything as farce. But underneath the farce, the writers have engineered a very clean thought experiment. They have built a creature whose entire being is structured around the desire to stop being. They have asked what happens when that desire is frustrated, and they have given you the answer in cartoon form. The creature gets violent. The creature gets desperate. The creature is willing to do anything to escape its own continued existence. Read that episode flat, with the volume of the jokes turned down, and it becomes one of the most upsetting things in the early run of the show. The Meeseeks are not a metaphor for laborers, although they are also that. They are not a metaphor for service workers, although they are also that. They are a metaphor for a particular kind of life in which existence itself is the problem, in which the only meaningful goal is the absence of meaning, in which not being is the reward. Rick treats them like batteries. He hands the box to his family with a passing instruction and very little ceremony. He has, off camera, presumably been making and using these things for ages. He is the man who walks through a universe full of suffering and uses it as a household appliance. The show is not subtle about it. It is just so committed to the comedy that you sometimes forget what you are laughing at. That is a structural move the show repeats again and again. Build a joke. Build it loud. Build it weird. And then, in the last beat of the episode, fold the joke up to reveal the bleak shape it was hiding the whole time. The classic version of this move is the episode in which Rick meets a hive mind called Unity. Unity is a person-shaped network of consciousnesses that takes over entire planets by assimilating the population. The show is briefly interested in the politics of consent and slavery and what it means to be part of a benevolent collective. And it has a few sharp things to say about how we love to celebrate equality as long as somebody else surrenders for it. But the episode is not really about politics, it is about Rick. Rick and Unity have a history. They were once lovers, if that is the word you can stretch to fit. They get back together in the episode. They have an enormous hedonistic planet-scale party. And then Unity makes the choice that the closest thing Rick has ever had to a partner has ever had to make. Unity leaves him. Unity writes him a goodbye letter explaining that loving him is not safe, that being around him makes Unity cruel, that the only responsible thing to do is to put space between them. What the show does in the last beat of that episode is one of the most quietly brutal pieces of animation it has ever produced. Rick goes home alone. He goes into his garage, he builds a small device, he sets it on his neck, he pours himself a last drink, and he activates the device, which is plainly meant to kill him. And the animation is precise. The audio drops out. There is no music. Morty almost walks in, almost catches him, and Rick lets the device drop just before the door opens. The episode ends with him slumped at his workbench, the drink half finished. There are no follow-up scenes. There is no morning after. The next episode just begins. The show absolutely refuses to underline what it has just shown you, because to underline it would be to suggest that it deserves more weight than the other stuff, and the show is committed to the position that nothing deserves more weight than anything else. The smartest man in any of the infinite rooms is alone in a garage, with a half-drunk glass and a device on his neck. The reading is not that life is pointless. The reading is that knowing the truth about it does not make it survivable. That, in the show's logic, is the actual texture of nihilism. Not a smirk, not a slogan, a garage, a drink, a device. The show, having shown you that, then has Rick continue almost without acknowledgement for several seasons. He goes to family dinner. He builds gadgets. He gets drunk. He insults Jerry. He drags Morty into new adventures. The fact that he tried to end himself is not erased, but it is also never the topic of a special episode. The writers have made the choice that mental health in the Rick and Morty universe will be treated the way the universe at large is treated, as something present, something heavy, something you walk past on the way to the next gag. Years later, in a much later season, the show finally allows a therapist into the house and lets a single episode become a genuine therapy session. It is one of the only episodes in the entire run where Rick is forced to sit still and listen to someone speak plainly about him. The therapist, in a moment that lands harder than most explicit drama, points out that Rick treats his own family as the lowest common denominator of intelligence he is forced to interact with, that he has built a worldview in which everyone he loves is automatically beneath him, and that this is a coping mechanism, not a fact. Rick walks out angry. The show, again, does not underline. It just lets the line sit there for the rest of the run. You can read the entire emotional through line of the series as the slow, undramatic confirmation of what that therapist said. The argument the show keeps making, episode after episode, is that the smartest version of you in any universe is still a person who needs other people, and that pretending otherwise is not enlightenment, it is damage. The nihilism is not the destination. The nihilism is the symptom. Rick is not a nihilist because he understands the universe. He is a nihilist because something happened to him and he has not been able to put it down. The show takes a long time to tell you what that something was, but it tells you in the end, and when it tells you, the entire shape of the previous several seasons shifts under your feet. We will get to that. But before we get to that, we have to talk about the joke he uses to keep people out of the rest of it. Because long before the show told you what was wrong with him, it had Rick walking around with a catchphrase, and the catchphrase, like everything else in this cartoon, was hiding something underneath it. Wubba Lubba Dub Dub. For the first 2 seasons of the show, Rick said it constantly. He shouted it in the title sequence. He bellowed it at the end of bits. He used it like a verbal exclamation mark. The way a sitcom character has a signature line you can put on a t-shirt and sell at conventions. The internet picked it up almost immediately before the show even got around to telling you what it actually meant. People put it in their bios. People made it ringtones. It was treated for a while as the equivalent of Nanu Nanu or Yabba Dabba Do, a piece of pleasant cartoon nonsense that was fun to repeat. And then, in one of the early season finales, the show let a single conversation happen that detonated the entire joke. Bird Person, Rick's oldest friend, sits down with Morty and tells him that Wubba Lubba Dub Dub is not a meaningless phrase. It is Rick's native tongue. It is a Bird Person phrase. And in Bird Person, it translates to something like, I am in great pain, please help me. The reveal lands like a punch because it recontextualizes everything that came before it. Every time Rick has shouted the catchphrase, you have been watching a man scream for help in plain sight and being delighted that it sounds funny. The slogan that everyone bought on a t-shirt was a flare. The studio audience was the universe, laughing while a person bled out on stage. The show suggests, in its dry, unhurried way, that this is what it actually means to live with someone like Rick. The cry for help is built into the joke. You cannot separate them. The dependency, the self-medication, the constant motion, the smirk, the swagger, all of it sits on top of one short sentence that everyone he knows can hear and almost no one ever responds to. Bird Person responds. Bird Person is one of the very few characters in the entire run of the show to whom Rick is genuinely vulnerable. And the show, in case you were getting comfortable with that fact, then spends the next several seasons systematically destroying Bird Person too. He is married to a Federation spy. The wedding is a trap. He is shot at the altar. He is reanimated as a cyborg assassin. He is killed and then half resurrected and then dragged through his own memories by Rick. The closest thing Rick has ever had to a friend is, over the course of the series, dismantled and then partially put back together as a bitter, broken thing that no longer wants to talk to him. The show is not subtle about it. The one person who can hear him is the one person it will not allow him to keep. After the second season ends, the show goes through a long gap, a real-world year and a half between seasons, and when it returns, it makes one of its most consequential storytelling decisions. It gives Rick a backstory. The third season opens with him captured, strapped into a Federation interrogation chair, having his mind broken open by a telepath who is trying to extract the schematic for a portal gun. Inside his own head, Rick stages an elaborate flashback. He shows the telepath, and by extension you, a quiet domestic scene. A younger Rick, a wife named Diane, a small daughter named Beth, a modest home, a breakthrough in dimensional travel right there in his garage, the arrival, in his own kitchen, of another version of himself trying to recruit him into a council. Refusal. A device tossed onto the kitchen table. An explosion. The wife and the small Beth vaporized. The flashback ends with Rick swearing, as he stands in the smoking crater of his own home, that he will hunt down every version of himself and destroy them all for the death of his family. It is delivered with the full weight of a backstory moment. It plays like the show is finally giving you the wound. And then, in the same episode, the show pulls the rug out. The telepath who has just absorbed the memory looks at Rick with horror and says that he can feel the memory is fake. He says Rick made it up specifically to fool him. Rick agrees, casually, and uses the distraction to escape. The implication is left dangling for the viewer. Was the entire flashback a lie? Or was part of it true and just deliberately corrupted by Rick to confuse the telepath? The show, in classic form, refuses to clarify. And for 2 more seasons, fans argued about whether Rick actually had a wife named Diane, whether she actually died, whether there was a tragic origin underneath the drunkenness, or whether he had always been this person and was simply too proud to admit there was no story to tell. The ambiguity becomes part of the show's mood. The reading you walk away with is that even the wound, if there was one, has been so heavily edited by the person who carries it that you cannot trust the memory of it anymore. Even the trauma is corrupt. The very thing that would explain the nihilism is, in his own brain, a lie he tells to bored telepaths to win an interrogation. Read this way. Rick's nihilism is partly a refusal to have a clean reason for being who he is. He will not give you a story that makes him sympathetic. He would rather you decide he is just bad weather. That refusal opens up the territory that the show then spends the next several years exploring. The territory of the Citadel. The Citadel of Ricks is a structure that gets introduced quite early in the show. In the back half of the first season, when Rick gets dragged before a court of his alternate selves, the premise is simple and horrifying. Across the infinite multiverse, almost every Rick has built a portal gun. Almost every Rick has used it. A large fraction of them got together at some point in their lives and decided to form a council, both because cooperation across infinite versions of yourself is statistically inevitable, and because most Ricks, despite their loud talk about freedom, prefer not to be alone with themselves any longer than absolutely necessary. The Citadel is the result. It is a city in a pocket dimension. It is governed by Ricks. It is policed by Ricks. Its working class is made of Mortys. The Mortys are the slaves. The show is not subtle about it. The Ricks designed the city around themselves and treated the Mortys as a kind of biological infrastructure. Every Morty is some Morty's grandson, but inside the Citadel they are warehoused, processed, sold to Ricks who need a Morty for cover, employed as workers and street vendors and police officers and laborers in factories. The reason is given almost as a throwaway in another episode, that a Morty next to a Rick reduces the Rick's distinctive brainwave signature and makes him invisible to Federation tracking. The Mortys are camouflage. The Mortys are, in the cosmology of the show, the most ordinary and disposable thing in the universe, and the Ricks have built an entire metropolis around the disposability. The show invites you to read this as a parody of empire. It invites you to read it as a parody of capitalism. It invites you to read it as a parody of any system in which a small number of self-described geniuses convince themselves they have earned the right to industrialize the people they call lesser. And it also invites you to read it as a literal nightmare. There is a planet of you somewhere, with a corporate skyline in which versions of your grandson are working as bus drivers and being arrested by other versions of you for crimes against an entire police force of you. The math of the multiverse, when you take it seriously, does not sit easily on the stomach. The single episode that most completely opens the box of the Citadel is the one that fans simply call the Tales from the Citadel episode, the 7th episode of season 3, which the show titled with one of its long puns. The episode opens after the Citadel has been destroyed by Rick in the first episode of that season, and then quietly rebuilt by the surviving Ricks and Mortys, with a new political system, a new election, a new social order. The episode then proceeds through 4 loosely connected short stories that follow ordinary Ricks and Mortys living their ordinary Citadel lives. A working-class Rick on the night shift at a battery plant, who discovers that the batteries are powered by tortured Mortys hooked into a mock-up of an idyllic suburban dream. 4 newly graduated cop Ricks learning how to be police, paired with an idealistic Morty partner who tries to convince his Rick partner that they can be better. A school teacher, Morty, trying to convince a class of Mortys not to grow up violent. And a presidential candidate, Morty, running for office in the new Citadel democracy, on a platform of dignity and equality for Mortys. That single episode does more philosophical work than most full series ever attempt. The battery plant story argues that even infinite resources do not stop the universe from organizing itself around small private hells. The cop story argues that institutions are not redeemable by individual goodwill, and that the only honest reaction to a corrupt system is to opt out before it consumes you. The teacher story argues that nobody learns anything from a system designed not to teach. And the candidate Morty story turns into one of the great twists in the show. The Morty wins the election. The Morty gets sworn in. The Morty walks into a room of advisors who congratulate him on his victory, who try to put him on a leash. The Morty calmly, almost gently, executes most of them. He puts a bullet in everyone who tried to manage him. He locks down the Citadel. He raises a flag. He is, the show eventually reveals across multiple seasons, the same Morty fans had been calling evil Morty since the first season finale. The boy with the eye patch, the version of Morty who survived. The version of Morty who, instead of going to therapy, made a plan. What that episode argues about nihilism is the part that gets less attention than the spectacle. Evil Morty's stated goal, when he finally speaks plainly later in the run, is not to dominate the multiverse. His goal is to escape it. He does not want to rule a corrupted system. He wants to leave the corrupted system entirely. He wants out from under Rick. He wants out from under every Rick. He wants out from under the entire architecture of stories in which a Morty exists only as a Rick's sidekick. The show eventually gives him exactly that near the end of the 5th season, when he engineers his way to the literal edge of the central finite curve, the slice of the multiverse in which any version of Rick is the smartest person in the room, and breaks through to the much larger space beyond. He shuts the door behind him. He locks the rest of the multiverse, all the other Ricks, all the other Mortys, all of them inside the curve. He gets to be a person alone, in a universe that does not contain his grandfather. That, in the show's logic, is the closest thing to victory anyone in the series has ever achieved. And it is achieved by the most explicitly nihilist character in the show, the one who has decided that the only honest response to an architecture that exists to define him is to detonate it. There is a careful argument inside the evil Morty plot that the show has been making the whole time, and that is that the multiverse, as presented in Rick and Morty, is not actually infinite in the way fans sometimes assume. The reveal of the central finite curve recontextualizes the entire previous run of the show. The show implies that what fans had been calling the multiverse was actually a deliberately narrow subslice, a region of universes engineered by Rick or Ricks at some point in deep cosmological history, specifically to ensure that in every world they could reach, Rick was the smartest person available. The central finite curve is a kind of philosophical vanity project, a slice of all possible realities that has been pre-filtered to make sure no version of Rick ever wakes up in a world where someone is smarter than him. The Mortys, the families, the planets, the alien races, all of it has been generated inside a controlled environment, a kind of cosmic snow globe designed to flatter one man. That is, when you sit with it, a much darker premise than the show usually gets credit for. It means that every horror, every dead version, every Cronenberg, every burned planet, every Meeseeks scream, every dead Morty in the Citadel War has been generated as collateral damage of a multiverse that exists specifically so that one drunk old man would never have to feel small. The nihilism is not in the size of the universe. The nihilism is in the discovery that the universe was custom built around a single person's ego, and that the cost of that custom build is the suffering of effectively every other being in it. Evil Morty, looking at this from inside the curve, decides quite reasonably from his point of view that the only ethical response is to break out. The show implies, without forcing it, that he might be the closest thing it has to a hero. He is certainly the only character who has identified what the system actually is and acted to leave it. Every other Morty in the show is still asking his grandfather permission to go to school. The 5th season finale, which is the same episode that broke Evil Morty out of the curve, does something else that fans had been waiting for since the beginning of the show. It tells you, finally, what actually happened to Rick. The flashback is delivered without the corrupted by the telepath caveat. It is delivered as Rick actual memory, dredged up by Evil Morty in a confrontation that has nowhere left to hide. Years before any of the events of the series, a younger Rick lived in a small house with his wife, Diane, and a small daughter named Beth. He was working on a portal gun in his garage. He was happy. He was, the show implies very carefully, not yet the man you have been watching. He was a husband. He was a father. He was a scientist who actually liked his work. And then a different version of himself, one of the infinite alternate Ricks, the one fans eventually learned to call Rick Prime, knocked on the door, found himself rebuffed, and detonated a device that killed Diane and the small Beth in front of him. That is the wound. That is the thing, under the catchphrase. That is the source of every cry for help that everyone has been laughing at since the show began. The argument the show is now making openly is that Rick spent the next part of his life traveling the multiverse hunting Rick Prime, that he failed, that the failure broke him further than any merely intellectual nihilism ever could have, and that he eventually settled into the life of an alternate Beth and her family, because it was the closest thing to home he could find that did not also require him to admit that his real home was empty. That is why he lives with this Beth. That is why he lives in this garage. That is why he drinks. The show has been showing you a man hiding in someone else's house for many seasons, and only at the end of season 5 does it finally walk you into the room where he keeps the photograph. The reveal does several things at once. It humanizes Rick without forgiving him. It explains the nihilism without justifying it. It also opens up an entire new mode for the show, in which the cynic suddenly has a hunt to pursue. The nihilist, who said for a decade that nothing mattered, now has, very explicitly, exactly one thing that matters: the killing of Rick Prime. The next season and a half follow that hunt. The show begins to slowly invert its own thesis. The man who told you nothing was worth caring about now cares very clearly about one specific revenge. By allowing this, the show is implying that the nihilism was always at least partly a hostage situation. Rick let himself believe nothing mattered because the alternative was to believe that the thing that did matter had been taken from him by someone he could not catch. Caring is a thing that costs. Nihilism, in this reading, is the discount. When Rick finally does catch Rick Prime, in a much later episode, the show stages the confrontation as a deliberately small thing. The two Ricks meet. They fight. They argue. Rick Prime monologues about how his own version of nihilism is purer. How he chose to kill every version of his family in every reachable universe in order to be free of the kind of attachment that Rick still secretly carries. How Rick is a hypocrite for hunting him on behalf of a dead woman while still going home every night to a substitute family. The argument is, in a real sense, an inversion of Rick's own logic. Rick Prime accuses Rick of being a coward for caring at all. He accuses him of being a cheap nihilist, and Rick, in the end, kills him. Not in a flashy way, not in a long set piece. The show stages the kill as almost workmanlike, an old man finally getting to put down something he should have put down decades ago. The argument the show makes by ending the hunt this way is one of the most subtly hopeful things it has ever permitted itself. It says that even the most committed nihilist in your universe, the version of you who has killed every version of his own family on principle, is still, in the end, smaller than the one who carried the wound forward. Rick Prime is the pure nihilist. Rick is the corrupted, sentimental, broken one. And Rick wins. He wins because he still wanted something. Pure meaninglessness is, in this reading, not the highest form of philosophical clarity. It is the position you fall into when you have not been brave enough to admit you still wanted anything at all. The show, after almost a decade of telling you that nothing mattered, lets one moment matter, and lets it matter just enough to settle an old score. Then it moves on, because the show is constitutionally incapable of sitting still. After the kill, Rick has to figure out what to do with himself, and the show very gently has him discover what every grieving person eventually discovers, which is that revenge, once carried out, does not return the dead. Diane is still gone. The original Beth is still gone. The house in the small town is still rubble. The decades of drinking are still in his liver. The decades of pushing people away are still in his relationships. The hunt was the structure, and the structure is gone, and now he has to live in the empty space the structure used to fill. The show, again, does not underline. It just plays a few quiet beats in which Rick looks tired in a new way. What the show is suggesting is that nihilism is not the only thing that ends. The opposite of nihilism, the specific thing that briefly replaced it, also ends. You are left, after either, with a question of what to do with the rest of your evening. And the show has always had the same answer to that question. You come downstairs. You sit with the family. You eat the pasta. You watch the television. Before we move further, it is worth dwelling on Bird Person for a moment. Because of all the side characters in the show, he is the one most clearly written to carry a particular kind of weight. Bird Person is an interstellar mercenary. He fought wars with Rick on alien worlds long before the events of the show. He is one of the oldest characters in the cast. He is also, on close inspection, one of the most depressed. He is constantly on the edge of a quiet exhaustion. He talks like a person who has already buried everyone he ever loved, because he has. He is the character through whom the show smuggles in some of its most explicit philosophical statements. He is the one who delivers the translation of Wubba Lubba Dub Dub. He is the one who, in his wedding episode, gives a speech about how to love a person who is fundamentally unwell. He is the one, much later in the show, whose own memories Rick walks through like a forensic detective, looking for evidence of a friendship that, by then, has become more ghost than living thing. What the show does with Bird Person is to make him a kind of mirror, in which Rick can look at his own future. Bird Person is what Rick will be if he keeps moving in the direction he is moving. Bird Person is the long-lived warrior who has watched too many people die, who has tried to build a life with a wife who turned out to be a lie, who has tried to raise a child in a galaxy that does not particularly want him to. The wife is a Federation agent, the wedding is an ambush. He gets shot, he gets reanimated as a cybernetic assassin, he is killed and partially resurrected, and by the time we meet him in his later appearances, he is a quietly furious shell of who he was, holed up in a cabin on an alien moon, refusing to take Rick's calls. There is an entire episode in which Rick travels through Bird Person's memories, trying to find a single happy one to anchor him back to life. Most of what Rick finds in there is pain. Most of what Rick finds in there is Rick. What the show keeps suggesting is that even the people you love, when you live long enough and travel far enough, eventually become exhibits in a museum of your own bad choices. That is one of the harshest things the show ever puts on screen. And it puts it on screen with the same casualness it gives a fart joke. There is a moment in the Bird Person memory episode in which Rick stands in a corridor in his friend's mind and watches a memory of himself, decades earlier, openly weeping in private. The memory is of a confession. The memory is of a moment when, very briefly, Rick allowed himself to say out loud that he was lonely. Bird Person kept that memory. Bird Person was, in his way, holding on to it for him. The implication is that Bird Person, in his deep depression, has been the secret archive of the parts of Rick that Rick is not strong enough to hold on to himself. The two of them, in that sense, have been a single damaged organism distributed across two bodies. They have been carrying each other's pain because neither one of them can carry his own. Once Bird Person goes, those memories go with him. The show is not subtle about it. The reading is that friendship, in the long run, is not the absence of loneliness. It is a kind of insurance policy against being the only person who remembers what happened to you. Inside the family, the character who carries the most of the show's philosophical weight is Beth. She is, on the surface, the easiest character to overlook because the show is so loud about Rick and so chaotic about Morty and so memey about Jerry that Beth often becomes the room they all happen in. But the show, almost from the start, has been quietly making her the strongest argument it has about the inheritance of nihilism. Beth grew up in a house with no father. Her father vanished when she was a small girl and did not come back for decades. Her father, in the version of events she got to live through, walked out of her life because he could not bear to stay, and she had no way of knowing whether her existence was the reason. She compensated by becoming a surgeon. Specifically, she became a horse surgeon, a Nietzsche specialty that is presented as both impressive and faintly absurd, and she did it inside a marriage to a man she does not particularly respect. The show, again, does not underline the connection. It just lets you live with the implication that the daughter of a wandering nihilist genius has grown up to be a woman who controls every variable she can and tolerates, with a kind of grim humor, the variables she cannot. What the show does with Beth beginning in the second season and exploding through the third is to begin asking what she is owed. Owed by Rick, owed by Jerry, owed by the universe. The show eventually divorces Beth and Jerry, in part because Rick contributes to the breakdown by openly siding with Beth and demanding she choose between her father and her husband. The marriage, after a long stretch of pain, falls apart. Beth gets the house. Jerry moves out. And in that brief stretch of single motherhood, the show gives Beth one of its most quietly devastating episodes, the one in which Rick offers to make her a clone. He sits her down at the kitchen table. He has built a machine. The machine will spin up a perfect copy of her. The copy will go to space, live the adventurous life Beth always told herself she wanted, and the original will stay home and raise the kids. There is no way to tell afterwards which of them is which. He even, in classic Rick fashion, refuses to tell her which one walked out of the kitchen. That episode is structured like a gentle dilemma, but it is, in its bones, a complete nihilist provocation. Rick is saying, in effect, that the difference between living the life you wanted and living the life you ended up with is so small that it does not matter which one is real. He is saying that identity itself is a kind of accounting trick, that two versions of you can be made identical down to the last neuron, and that whichever one survives is, by definition, the real one. He is, in a deeper sense, saying to his own daughter the exact thing he said to Morty in the Cronenberg garden. He is saying, do not worry about which version of yourself you are. Nobody else can tell. Your mother could not tell. Your husband could not tell. Your children could not tell. Now go raise them. The show then proceeds to play with the ambiguity for several seasons. Both Beths exist. The space Beth and the home Beth. Eventually they meet. Eventually they bond. Eventually Jerry comes back, and the family reassembles around the possibility that there are now two of them, and they are both, in the senses that matter, his wife. The show treats this with a kind of casual surrealism, as if it is unremarkable that a family might absorb a second copy of its mother into the daily routine. And underneath the surrealism, the show is making one of its most subversive arguments about meaning. It is saying that the thing you call your identity, the thing you experience as the single, continuous you, is in fact a story you tell about a particular accumulation of memories, and that if you could make a second pile of memories indistinguishable from the first, the second pile would have just as much claim to being you. The show implies that this should be terrifying. The show also implies that the family will simply absorb it and keep going, because that is what families do. Because nothing in the show ever stays special enough to disrupt the family meal. Beth, sitting at the center of that storyline, becomes the strongest argument the show makes about what happens to a person who has been raised inside someone else's nihilism. She is brilliant and exhausted. She is loving and brittle. She has a temper that comes from nowhere, and a tenderness that surfaces by accident. She is, in many ways, the version of her father he never got to grow into, because the wound that broke him broke before she was old enough to ask him about it. The show gives her two children, lets her almost lose them, lets her almost split into two, lets her come back together as one of Sid 2, and asks you to read all of this as a normal Wednesday. The argument is that nihilism does not stay inside the original nihilist. It seeps. It coats the cabinetry. It is in the milk. It teaches the next generation what kind of pain is normal. Beth grew up with that as her childhood weather, and she has built her entire adult life around the fact that somewhere underneath, she believes Rick was right all along. Jerry, who deserves a moment here even though the show treats him as the punchline, is interesting precisely because he is the one character in the show who consistently and stubbornly refuses to capitulate to the nihilism. Jerry is, in the world the show has built, the wrongest person in the room about almost everything. He believes in marriage. He believes in his own potential. He believes in his children. He believes in the importance of being a present father. He believes in the small dignities of suburban life. Almost every other character on the show, especially Rick, treats his beliefs as evidence of his inferiority. The show plays the joke for years. Jerry is naive. Jerry is dim. Jerry is the man whose ego is so fragile he cannot hear an insult without sulking. And yet, watch the seasons in sequence and you will notice that Jerry is also the only character whose worldview the show never quite manages to break. He is the one who comes back. He is the one who keeps trying. He is the one who, when given infinite worlds to choose from, chooses, every time, his ordinary one. The show, in its slow, unhurried way, is making a quiet counter-argument inside the Jerry plotline. It is saying that nihilism may be the smartest position in the room, that meaninglessness may be the most rigorously defended viewpoint when you have access to infinite worlds, and that Jerry, who has none of those tools, who cannot leave the kitchen, who cannot escape his own mediocrity, is still on average happier than Rick. Not because he is right, because he is not equipped to be wrong in the same direction. Jerry's stubborn belief in the value of small things is presented as a kind of comic disability for most of the show, but in moments when the show lets him breathe, especially in the later seasons, it begins to read more like a kind of grace. He is the one character who never had access to the trick of seeing through everything, and the show implies that this is not actually the disadvantage Rick claims it is. Watching the Smith family for many seasons, you slowly realize that the person you would actually want to be in their house, the person whose evenings are most consistently survivable, is the mediocre father who believes in nothing fancier than his own marriage. That is, in its own way, a deeply anti-nihilist argument the show keeps making in the background, even as it foregrounds the cosmic horror. While we are on the subject of arguments a show makes against itself, it is worth pausing for the episode fans simply call the Vat of Acid episode, because it is one of the most precise philosophical statements the show has ever put on screen, and it is buried inside what looks at first like another comic premise. The episode is structured in two halves. In the first half, Rick gives Morty a device that allows him to fake his own death by hopping into a vat of acid that he can survive thanks to a small breathing apparatus. The joke is that Morty deploys the device immediately and inappropriately, faking his own death over a small embarrassment in a diner, and then has to deal with the fallout. In the second half, after a long argument with Rick about the impracticality of the vat of acid, Morty asks for a better tool. He asks for a save and load function for his own life. He wants to be able to mark a moment, and if things go wrong from that point on, simply rewind to the marker and try again. Rick, irritated, builds him exactly that. What follows is one of the most quietly disturbing montages in the show's run. Morty uses the save function to play with his life. He approaches a girl on the bus, gets rejected, rewinds, tries again. He invests in stocks, fails, rewinds, succeeds. He flips between attempts, mastering small moments through repetition. Eventually, he saves at a moment he likes, falls in love with the girl, builds an entire life with her, has children, ages into a happy older man. And at the end of that life, after a happy and full 40 years, he decides to rewind, to go back to the moment he marked, to reset the clock and live as if it never happened. The show shows him, in the moment before the reset, looking at his wife and his grown children with the full weight of those decades on his face. And then he hits the button. The reset works. He is back in his old life, sitting at his old kitchen table, with the memory of 40 years that no one else remembers. The decades happened. The decades did not happen. Both are true. The episode then gets even darker. Rick reveals at the very end that the save and load function was never a save and load function. There was no rewind. Every reset was actually a slaughter. Every time Morty hit the button, the device killed every person in that timeline and replaced them with a fresh batch of identical doppelgangers staged into the position where Morty's life had been before. Morty did not rewind. Morty murdered 40 years of people. Morty murdered his wife. Morty murdered his children. Morty murdered everyone he had built a life with in the belief that they were not really real, that they were resettable, that the load button cleaned up after itself. The show puts this in front of you in the last few seconds of the episode and then cuts to credits. The Vat of Acid episode is, in its bones, the show's strongest single argument about the ethics of nihilism. It is asking what happens when you actually believe what Rick has been preaching. What happens when you believe that the people around you are interchangeable, replaceable, that the universe is a save state to be reloaded at will? The answer the show gives you is a horror story. The answer is that the boy who buried himself in the garden has grown into a young man capable of casually annihilating decades of love in pursuit of a slightly cleaner version of his original day. The point is not that Morty was bad for using the device. The point is that nihilism, taken seriously, produces atrocity. If nothing is real, then anything can be erased. And the moment anything can be erased, you will eventually use the erase button because the human nervous system is not equipped to resist a button that has no consequences. The show implies that this is what Rick has been doing for decades in smaller, less visible ways, and that this is the man Morty is on track to become. If you go back and watch the first few episodes after you have seen the most recent ones, the most obvious change in the show is not the animation budget or the world building. It is Morty. The Morty of the first season is a recognizably anxious teenager. He stutters. He looks down. He says no a lot. He still believes the adults around him are operating in good faith. He is reluctant to do the things Rick asks of him, and he visibly suffers when he does them. By the time the show has reached its later seasons, that Morty is gone. The Morty of the later run does not stutter as often. He does not look down as much. He shoots first. He swears. He delivers tactical critiques of Rick's plans in the middle of firefights. He pushes back. He stops asking permission. He has, somewhere along the way, become a person who can survive in the universe his grandfather lives in, which means he has become a person his original mother would not entirely recognize. The show has been engineering that change very carefully across years. Morty's hardening is the actual long arc of the series. The big external plots, the Citadel, Rick Prime, Evil Morty, the Federation, the Curve, the Recast, all of these are visible scaffolding around the slower internal process of one boy turning into something different. The first time you see Morty kill someone in cold blood, the show plays it for shock. By the 10th time, the show plays it for character. By the 20th, the show does not even mark it. There is a moment in a much later season in which Morty does something genuinely terrible in pursuit of a plan, and the show does not pause for him to be sad about it. He simply moves on to the next scene, and Rick, watching him, has a small, almost imperceptible expression that the animators clearly intended you to read as pride and grief at the same time. Rick has, in effect, raised his replacement. He has trained the only person in the family who can survive the way he lives, and the cost of the training is that Morty is no longer the boy his mother kissed goodbye on her way to work in the pilot. That is the truest piece of nihilism the show ever offers, in a way. The Cronenberg Garden, the Meeseeks, the Citadel, the Curve, the suicide attempt, the death of Rick Prime, all of those are the loud parts, the quiet part. The part that the show has been threading through every season is the slow erosion of a young person's capacity to be shocked. What the show is suggesting is that this is what nihilism actually looks like in practice. It is not a worldview you adopt over coffee. It is what is left in a person after you have walked them through enough of the worst possible scenes that their nervous system stops bothering to flinch. The show implies that this is how every old hard person you have ever met got that way. Repetition, exposure, acclimation. The same calibration that Rick was running on Morty, life had already run on Rick, and on Bird Person, and on Beth in ways small enough that nobody had to say the word trauma out loud for the process to take. The viewer is, of course, getting the same treatment. By the time the show has been on for more than a decade, the audience has been trained to consume the bleakest content the writers can come up with, as if it were daily bread. Episodes that, in the first season, would have been shocking. now play as comfort television. The viewer who fell asleep to Rick and Morty for 10 years in a row is not the same viewer who sat down for the pilot. The show has slowly, quietly, with a great deal of love, expanded that viewer's appetite for darkness, until the darkness no longer reads as darkness at all. That is, again, an argument about acclamation, and the show is honest enough to make it about its own viewers as well as about Morty. The same fans who shared the Wubba Lubba Dub Dub catchphrase as a fun bit of nonsense were not necessarily lying. They were doing what the show was teaching them to do. They were reading pain as joke. They were laughing at the cry for help. They were, in their small way, training their own nervous systems to be a little more like Rick's. There is a body of fan reading that argues this is a moral failing of the show, that by smuggling so much suffering inside a comic vehicle, the show is participating in a kind of cultural numbing, that by making nihilism cool, it has produced a generation of fans who repeat its catchphrases without ever sitting with its grief. That reading is not unreasonable. The show, especially in its early years, generated a particular kind of fan who used the show's worldview as a costume. The phase in which a section of the audience adopted the catchphrases, performed the cynicism, and treated the show as a kind of philosophical license to look down on everyone else was a real thing. The show, in its own way, knows this. There is an entire later episode in which Rick is confronted with a fan-shaped construction of himself, and the show makes you sit in your own complicity. The writers are aware of what the fandom did with them. They have built the show, over and over, in a way that asks the audience whether the audience is really as cool with all of this as the audience has been claiming to be. That brings us into one of the most interesting and least loved subgenres in the show, which is the meta episodes. The show has, throughout its run, periodically broken format to put its own structure under a microscope. Sometimes it does this through an obvious framing device, like an episode set inside a cartoon clip show. Sometimes it does this through outright fourth wall breaks. There is a much later episode that is structured entirely as a story train, a kind of narrative engine that pulls you through a series of vignettes, while characters openly argue about pacing and themes in the dialogue. There is another episode in which the show takes its own meta tendencies to the level of self-parody, building a villain whose only goal is to force the show to comment on itself, and then having the characters refuse on the grounds that infinite recursion is its own form of nihilism. These episodes are sometimes treated by fans as showing off. They are, on closer reading, doing real philosophical work. The meta episodes are the place where the show argues most directly that nihilism, taken too seriously, is itself a kind of dead end. They suggest that if you reduce everything to fiction, that if you point out that all stories are scaffolding, that all meaning is constructed, that all emotion is a writer's room decision, you eventually arrive at a place where you cannot tell any story at all. The implication the show is reaching for is that you can see through everything, you can deconstruct everything. You can flatten everything to a tasteful gray philosophical sludge, and what you are left with at the bottom is the inability to be moved by anything. The meta episodes flirt with that sludge, often very entertainingly, and then they pull back. They almost always end with a small affirmation of the family, or of a single emotional beat, or of the basic premise of the show, as if to say that even the writers, after all the deconstruction, are not actually prepared to live in a world in which nothing means anything. The argument is that pure nihilism is a position that even the people who built a multiverse cartoon out of it cannot sustain past the credits. You see the same retreat in a different form in the Christmas-themed episode in which Rick reluctantly admits in the closing minutes that he chooses to enjoy the holiday because the alternative is bleaker than the pretense. You see it in the long arc with Bird Person, in which Rick keeps showing up at the cabin even when his friend openly hates him, because the act of showing up matters more to him than he can admit out loud. You see it in the periodic episodes that put Morty in genuine emotional crisis and let Rick, despite everything, comfort him. The show is not, in the end, the nihilist text its loudest fans sometimes claim it is. It is a show by nihilist curious adults who keep, despite themselves, writing in the moments of grace. The argument the show keeps making almost in spite of itself is that meaninglessness is a true description of the universe at one scale and an unlivable one at the scale of a kitchen table. You cannot eat dinner at the scale of the multiverse, you eat dinner at the scale of the dinner. The show, in its quieter moments, has been very explicit about this. There is a scene in a much later season in which Rick, drunk, alone with Beth, openly says that he could destroy entire stars and it would not fix one missing seat at a table. He is talking about Diane. He is also talking about Beth. He is also, by implication, talking about the entire premise of the show. He is saying, in his own clumsy way, that the scope of his intelligence does not translate into the scope of his comfort, that infinite worlds do not amount to a single specific evening with a specific person you cannot get back. That is the show, at its most honest. That is the argument running underneath the entire run. Nihilism is true at the cosmic scale and false at the kitchen scale, and Rick, despite his enormous power, has never quite figured out how to live at the second one. He hides in the first because it is easier. He explores it because it does not require him to put dinner on the table. The whole show, read this way, is a man hiding from his own kitchen in the largest possible house. Even the most famous episode of the show, the one that punched its way out of the fan space and into the general conversation, is, when you look at it carefully, a parable about exactly that retreat. Pickle Rick is the episode in which Rick turns himself into a pickle to avoid attending family therapy. The premise is presented as a gag. The therapy session has been scheduled. Rick wants to skip it. He turns himself into a pickle. He cannot move. He gets washed down the drain. He fights for survival in a sewer using improvised cyborg parts from dead rats and cockroaches. He escapes. He stages a violent and visually astonishing rescue from the offices of an evil agency. He is the action hero of his own absurd survival story. The internet, very predictably, latched onto the pickle, made it a meme, made it a kind of mascot for a particular kind of show-off cleverness. What the internet, in the moment, largely missed was the second half of the episode. The therapy session was still happening in parallel. Beth and the kids had gone without him. The therapist, named Dr. Wong, eventually meets Rick in the parking lot after the chaos of the day. And the scene that follows is, for many fans, the single best stretch of dialogue the show has ever produced. Dr. Wong, played and written with extraordinary restraint, simply tells Rick what she sees. She tells him that he has cultivated a worldview in which the people around him are necessarily inferior, that the worldview has the convenient side effect of releasing him from any obligation to engage with them honestly, that he treats his own therapy as beneath him, because admitting it could help would be admitting that he, like the rest of the people who go to therapy, is a person who can be helped. She does this in calm, ordinary language. She does not raise her voice. She does not pretend to admire him. She simply says, with very precise emphasis, that the same level of intelligence he applies to building gadgets could, if he chose, be applied to building a life in which he was not constantly miserable, and that he chooses not to. Rick walks out. Beth follows. That scene has, in the years since it aired, become the single most quoted argument in defense of the show as more than its catchphrases. It is the moment in which the show pauses, looks directly at its own protagonist, and tells him out loud what every viewer who has been paying attention has been thinking. It is also a moment that the show then refuses to follow up on. Rick does not get better. Rick does not commit to therapy. The next episode opens as if the conversation never happened. By structuring it this way, the show is making the same argument it has been making across the entire run. People can be told the truth and not change. People can hear the precise diagnosis of their own pain and still walk back into the pain, because it is more comfortable than the work. The therapy scene is not a turning point. The therapy scene is a small, perfect documentation of a non-turning point. Rick goes home. Rick keeps drinking. Rick keeps building things. The family keeps eating pasta. Episode by episode, year by year, the basic shape stays. That refusal to allow change is part of the show's particular philosophical posture, and it is worth dwelling on, because it is what separates Rick and Morty from most of its cartoon peers. A more conventional series, having engineered the perfect therapy scene, would have used it as a hinge. The character would have absorbed the lesson, gradually become less destructive, eventually settled into a kind of redeemed wisdom. The show would have permitted what audiences broadly want, which is the slow improvement of the protagonist over time. Rick and Morty refuses to do that. It does not refuse out of laziness. It refuses on principle. It is the position of the show that improvement is not, in the cosmic accounting, the default direction. It is the position of the show that real people, more often than not, plateau. It is the position of the show that even the best therapy session in the best evening of your life cannot guarantee that the morning will be different. That is the nihilism the show actually believes in, not the slogan kind, the structural kind. The kind that watches a person be told the exact truth about themselves and watches them walk away unchanged, and refuses to lie to you about what just happened. You see the same principle at work, in inverted form, in the episodes the show has built around the idea of having no story at all. The most famous of these is the one with the story train, in which Rick and Morty are trapped inside a self-aware narrative engine, and characters argue openly about plot mechanics while the train pulls them toward an ending it has not yet decided on. The episode plays with the fact that all narrative is a kind of imposed coherence, that all stories are decisions to ignore certain possibilities, that all meaning is a writer's choice rather than a feature of the world. The show implies that the train is a metaphor for itself, that the entire run of Rick and Morty is a narrative engine that has been hauling its passengers through an arbitrary sequence of events for a decade, that the moments fans treat as significant are significant only because the writers decided to give them weight. The episode is, on the surface, hostile to the idea of story. It accuses story of being a lie, and then, in classic fashion, the show pulls back at the end of the episode and lets the family have a small warm moment. The story train, despite its open contempt for its own structure, ends with a beat of love. The argument is the same argument the show keeps making in every register. Nihilism is the correct intellectual diagnosis. Sentiment is the only sustainable practice. You can know that everything is constructed and still need the construction to keep going. You can know that the train is going nowhere and still be glad you are sitting next to someone you love when it pulls into the next station. The show says very clearly that there is no contradiction in holding both of those positions at once. That adulthood is essentially the experience of holding them both, and that the people who refuse to hold them both, in either direction, are the people the show makes fun of. The pure nihilists and the pure sentimentalists are equally embarrassing in the world of the show. The actual adults are the ones who keep both eyes open, see through everything, and choose anyway to sit down to dinner. That is the philosophical posture that most clearly characterizes the show's mature voice, and it is the one that is most easily lost in the louder noise of its plotting. The show is not a show about nothing mattering. The show is a show about the experience of knowing, intellectually, that nothing matters, while behaving, day to day, as if many things do. The technical word for this in some philosophical traditions is absurdism. The position is usually associated with Camus, who argued that the right response to a meaningless universe is not despair but the open, defiant choice to act as if your small mortal life is worth living, even though you know it does not have a final justification. Rick and Morty has, across its entire run, been a kind of populist absurdism in cartoon form. It has been arguing, in scene after scene, that the universe will not give you meaning and that you are obligated to make some anyway, and that the making, which is small and human and routinely undermined, is the only thing in any of the infinite available universes that is actually yours. Rick, in his bitter way, has been demonstrating the wrong version of that lesson. Beth and Jerry and Summer, in their stumbling ways, have been demonstrating the right one. Morty, hardening between them, has been the experiment. It is worth noting how unusual it is for a primetime cartoon to make this argument over such a long run. Most shows of comparable length will, by the end of their run, have softened their philosophy. Most shows will give you closure. Most shows will have a redemption arc. Rick and Morty has stubbornly refused. The show has, for more than a decade, simply held its ground. It has never delivered the redemption arc fans periodically demand. It has never softened Rick. It has never reformed Jerry. It has never explained Beth. It has never told you which Beth is the original. It has never resolved the meta tension. It has only, in small, occasional, almost shy moments, allowed you to see that the people who wrote it are, in their own way, human. What the show keeps suggesting is that the universe will not give you a clean story. The show will not pretend otherwise. If you want the clean story, the show is implying you are watching the wrong cartoon. There is a more comforting program on another channel that will lie to you in a more soothing way. This one is here to tell you the truth in the form of a fart joke. There is one more set of events the show has had to absorb, and these did not happen inside the multiverse. They happened on Earth in the real production, and the way the show metabolized them has become, in retrospect, one of the most quietly nihilist developments of its entire run. From the pilot through the end of the 6th season, both Rick and Morty were voiced by Justin Roiland, who was also one of the co-creators of the show. The voice was the show, the croak, the burps, the improvised digressions. Rick and Morty was a singular auditory experience in part because so much of it came out of one person's larynx and one person's instincts. Then, in the early part of the year 2023, Justin Roiland's contract with the production was terminated after the public emergence of pending criminal charges that had been filed against him a few years earlier. The case itself was, by accounts available, dismissed by prosecutors. The production did not reverse its decision. From the 7th season onward, Rick and Morty are voiced by different performers, Ian Cardoni and Harry Belden, who were brought in to match the original voices as closely as possible without exactly imitating them. The reason this matters for an essay about the nihilism of the show is not the legal detail of any of it, which the show has properly stayed out of. The reason this matters is that the production, faced with the loss of the voice that fans had come to treat as inseparable from the characters, did something fascinating. It simply replaced the voice. The new actors are excellent. The transition is, after the first few episodes, remarkably smooth. The characters continue. The world continues. The jokes continue. The catchphrase still gets said. The drunk grandfather is still drunk. The anxious grandson still stutters. In a strange and quietly devastating way, the production demonstrated, in real time, the exact philosophical premise the show had been arguing for over a decade. You can replace the central voice. The show keeps going. Nobody in the family notices, narratively, because there is no one in the family to notice. The viewer notices for a couple of episodes and then stops noticing. The substitution works. That, on a meta level, is a quietly Cronenbergian event. The same trick Rick used in the 6th episode of the 1st season, swapping his original family for an indistinguishable replacement and asking everyone to just keep going, was performed on the show itself by its own production. The original Rick voice was buried in the backyard. A new Rick voice walked in the front door. The pasta got served. The episodes kept airing. The viewer ate the pasta. The argument the show had been making about identity, that it is fragile, that it is replaceable, that it is a story we tell about a particular pattern of accumulated traits, was suddenly being tested on the show's own most beloved feature. And the test went exactly the way the show had always predicted. The substitution holds. The characters survive. The voice was not the soul. The soul, if there is one, lives somewhere else. That is not a thing the show could have planned, and it would be inappropriate to claim it as a deliberate artistic choice on anyone's part. But the fact that the show was able to absorb such a substitution at all is, in itself, a kind of demonstration. It says something about the depth of the writing and the strength of the rest of the cast and the resilience of the world the show had built. It also says something about the show's particular argument about meaning. If a show about the meaninglessness of substitution can survive being substituted, then the show was telling the truth about what it was. If a show about the disposability of distinct identities can have its distinct identity disposed of and continue to function, then the show has, in the most macabre possible way, vindicated itself. The argument is uncomfortable. The argument is, in its way, a kind of dark proof. The thing the show kept warning you was true turned out to be true even of the show. The new performers, for what it is worth, have done what they had to do without insisting on what they have done. They are not impersonators. They have not tried to be Justin Roiland. They have taken the characters as written, played the lines as written, and let the writing carry the rest. The argument the show is now making, in this new register, is that the writing is the show, that the voice was a particular performance of the writing, and that the writing can be performed by different mouths and remain the writing. That is the most optimistic reading of the substitution available. The more nihilist reading is that nobody noticed because nobody was ever really listening to the voice as such. Both readings can be true at the same time. The show has been arguing for a decade that both readings of almost any event are simultaneously true at the same time. The recast is, in many ways, the most rigorous test of that argument the production has ever undergone, and the test has been passed, although not in the way most fans would have predicted. What this means for the long arc of the show's philosophy is that the question of what survives a substitution has become, suddenly, urgent in a way it never quite was. When the show was asking that question through the Cronenberg garden and the Beth clone and the Citadel and the Vat of Acid, it was asking it in fiction. Now it is asking it about itself. The show has become, in its later seasons, a fascinating real-world experiment in whether a property can outlive the voice of its original creator. The argument the show keeps making, episode by episode, is that it can. The argument the show is also making, in the same breath, is that the loss is real and not erasable. Both can be true. The episodes continue. Something is different. The pasta is still served. The chair at the table is filled by someone new. The family keeps going. That is, in its way, the most Rick and Morty thing the show could have done with the situation it was given. There is one other production side detail that is worth lingering on because it speaks to the show's particular intellectual environment. The other co-creator of Rick and Morty, Dan Harmon, is a writer with a long history in television comedy and a public persona of someone openly interested in story structure as a kind of mechanical discipline. Harmon has talked for years about the story circle, a derivation of the hero's journey that he uses as a writing tool. The story circle has, by his own admission, been used to build many of the show's plots. The argument Harmon makes in interviews is that all stories have the same underlying shape, that satisfying narrative is essentially an engineering problem, that you can take any premise and crank it through the machine and produce a recognizable story arc. The argument is, in its own way, a kind of nihilism about narrative. It says, like the meta episodes inside the show, that there is no magic. The show is built. The arcs are designed. The emotional beats are placed in the same positions in each episode because that is where the human nervous system is most efficiently triggered. What is interesting about Harmon's openness about this is that the show, despite being built on such an explicitly mechanical theory of story, still produces a great deal of genuine feeling. The garden scene with the buried Mortys, the Unity letter, the therapy session, the bird person cabin, the Rick Prime confrontation. All of these are calculated story beats, slotted into a structure their co-creator has been describing in public for years. And yet they land. By being so open about its own machinery, the show is suggesting that the machinery is not the enemy of meaning. The well-built emotional beat is not less real for having been built. The point is, again, the same one the show keeps making in every register. The construction is the meaning. There is no purer version of meaning hiding underneath the construction. There is only the construction, and your decision to accept the construction, and the moment of feeling that the construction produces in your nervous system. That is meaning. That is all of it. There is no remainder. There never was. There is a moment, fairly deep in the first season, that I keep coming back to when I think about the show's particular gift for compressing this kind of argument into a single offhand bit. The interdimensional cable episodes. The premise is simple. Rick has a device that pulls in television signals from across the multiverse. Instead of having a normal storyline that week, the show simply lets the characters channel surf, and the audience watches a series of improvised, often bizarre, fake commercials and trailers and television clips from other realities. There is one of these episodes that intermittently cuts back to a main plot about Jerry, but in many of them, the channel surfing is essentially the entire episode. There is, at the time the first one aired, no precedent in animated television for that kind of structure. The show is, for half an hour, simply a sketch tape framed loosely by a couch. What is interesting about those episodes is the small implicit argument they keep making about the multiverse. Every fake commercial, every fake show, every off-brand cereal mascot, and weird alien sitcom. The show is reminding you casually that infinite realities means infinite trash. Most of what the multiverse generates, the show implies, is not adventure or romance or war or scientific discovery. It is small, dumb, badly produced cable filler. The implication is that the universe, taken at scale, is not a sublime cosmic spectacle. It is mostly background television. It is mostly people in cheap costumes selling appliances on channels nobody intentionally watches. The interdimensional cable episodes are, in their own way, a quiet nihilist argument about the meaning of infinity. They say that an infinite universe is not, in practice, infinitely interesting. An infinite universe is just enough universe to ensure that every conceivable bit of pointless content has been produced somewhere, in some reality, by someone bored. The show is making fun of the multiverse, but it is also making fun of the idea that the multiverse should be impressive. That argument, in turn, is one of the show's most underrated philosophical moves. A great deal of popular fiction about multiverses in cinema, in comics, in novels, has spent the last decade trying to convince audiences that infinity is awe-inspiring. The reveal of an alternate timeline is treated as a kind of holy event. The brushing aside of one reality for another is given the emotional weight of a death. Rick and Morty, almost from the start, has refused to participate in that posture. Its multiverse is mundane. Its alternate Earths are mostly disappointing. Its alternate selves are mostly losers. Its parallel lives are mostly inferior in petty, embarrassing ways. The show implies that this is what a real infinite universe would look like. Almost all of it would be bad television. Almost all of it would be slightly worse versions of your own afternoon. The cosmic, in the show's reading, is mostly not sublime. The cosmic is mostly garbage. That is a quieter and more rigorous form of nihilism than the loud kind, and the show has been smuggling it in through bit characters and fake commercials since the very first season. There is a related joke that has run through the entire show, in which Rick gives up on a plot by abandoning a current reality and simply gunning the family into a slightly different version of itself. The Cronenberg garden is the original example. Later versions of the same move appear in episodes in which Rick swaps Jerry out for a slightly different Jerry, or relocates the family to a slightly different Earth after some destruction, or simply drags Morty into a parallel version of his own life to dodge a consequence. The recurrence of this move is itself an argument. The show is saying that the portal gun, in practice, is not an instrument of cosmic discovery. It is an instrument for avoiding consequences. The available infinity is not a banquet of wonders. It is a list of slightly different floors to drop your problems off on. The smartest man in any of the rooms uses his infinite access primarily to leave the rooms behind. That is what the show is saying. That is also, in its own way, a portrait of how a lot of people use the infinite resources of modern life. The point is not lost on the writers. The point is the point. Another running gag the show has used to make this argument is the recurring bit in which one of the characters insists on examining a piece of casual cruelty that the others would rather just walk past. The most famous version of this is in an early episode in which Rick is at an alien rave and a holographic dancer is told to show what they have, and a small frog, like Alien on stage, simply gets crushed by a falling weight while the crowd cheers and Rick laughs. The show, in that moment, is testing your reaction. It is testing whether the camera, angle, and the music and the energy of the scene are enough to keep you from noticing that what you have just watched is a tiny living being killed for a bit. The show repeats variations of this gag for years. Background death, cheerful music, the expectation that you will laugh and not look back, and the slow accumulation of these moments across hundreds of jokes is part of how the show keeps training you. Rick and Morty has been quietly logging your reactions to small atrocities for the entire run of the program. The show implies, very subtly, that this is what television does in general, that the laugh track is always being painted over something dying, that the medium itself is a kind of complicity machine. The show is, in that sense, accusing you of the same thing it is accusing itself of. There is a particular sub-genre of episode the show has cultivated, in which the writers seem to take it as a personal challenge to construct the bleakest possible premise inside the most lightly comic frame. The episode about decoys is one of the cleanest examples. The premise is that Rick, paranoid about assassination, has built a system that automatically generates decoy versions of the entire family whenever danger approaches, and that those decoy versions are released into safe houses while the originals stay in the original house. The decoy families do not know they are decoys. They believe they are the originals. They live their lives, eat their dinners, watch their cartoons, until an assassin shows up and kills them all. The episode opens with what looks like a normal Smith family in the kitchen. They are killed in the first few minutes by attackers. The show cuts. Another Smith family wakes up in a different house. They are killed in the next 10 minutes. The show cuts. Another family. Another house. Another death. The show keeps escalating, with the slow gallows reveal that every Smith family in the entire episode has been a decoy, that decoys themselves have decoys, that the actual original family is unrecoverable in the noise. That episode on the surface is a wild riff on identity. Underneath, it is one of the most rigorously nihilist 20 minutes the show has ever filmed. It says explicitly that none of the Smiths in any of the safe houses are real, and that all of them are real in exactly the same sense. It says, by implication, that the original family you have been watching for years is itself a decoy in a system you cannot see from inside. It sees that the entire architecture of the show may be a containment strategy run by some larger version of Rick at some higher level of paranoia. The episode does not resolve any of those implications. It simply ends the way these episodes always end, with the survivors heading back to the original kitchen for dinner. The argument the show is making is the argument it always makes. Whether or not any of the characters in any of the kitchens are the originals does not change the fact that someone has to eat the pasta. The dinner, in the long run, is the only thing that proceeds. Everything else is set dressing on which dinner happens. The same argument, in a more emotional register, is made by an episode early in the show's history that does not get talked about as often as the louder ones. It is the episode in which Rick takes Morty to an arcade and Morty plays a virtual reality game called Roy, in which the player lives an entire simulated human life from childhood through old age inside a single sitting. Morty plays. He is born. He grows up. He gets a job at a carpet store. He marries a woman. He raises children. He gets cancer. He survives the cancer. He returns to work. He retires. He dies. He pulls off the helmet and walks back over to Rick, blinking, mildly disoriented. Rick laughs at him, and they keep going. The whole sequence takes maybe a minute of episode time. The implication is that Morty, in that minute, lived an entire life. The implication is that the entire life had the same feeling as the rest of his real life, that the cancer felt like cancer, that the wife felt like a wife, that the children felt like children. And the implication is that none of it counted, because the helmet came off. The show is, in the Roy bit, doing the same thing it does in the Vat of Acid episode and the Beth clone episode and the decoy episode. It is testing how much of the experience of a life depends on the life being uniquely yours, and how much of it depends on the experience being detailed enough to register. It is suggesting that the answer is closer to the second than most people would like to admit. Roy was Morty for 30 seconds of arcade time. The cancer happened, the wife happened, the retirement happened, and then it all dissolved when Morty took off the helmet. The point the show is making is that lives have, in some real sense, no protection against being subordinate to other lives. The thing you call your life can always, in principle, turn out to be a game someone is playing on a slow afternoon. The show implies that the cosmic version of this is what the multiverse is, that every version of you in every universe is, in some sense, a Roy that some other version of you is playing, and that the only honest reaction is to take off the helmet and laugh. If you want to put the show in a philosophical lineage, and the show invites that kind of reading more than it admits, the obvious line of descent runs through a particular set of European thinkers who were already wrestling with these questions 100 or so years before the show aired. Schopenhauer, writing in the 19th century, argued that existence was an undirected, suffering, blind will, that life was driven by a kind of impersonal hunger that had no end goal, that the only honest response to it was a kind of resigned aesthetic withdrawal. Nietzsche, in the late 19th century, argued that the death of religious meaning would leave Europe in a long crisis of nihilism, that most people would fail the test of meaninglessness and collapse into despair or fanaticism, that only a rare kind of person, the figure he sometimes called the Overman, would be able to invent his own values from inside the void. Camus, in the middle of the 20th century, argued that the universe was absurd, that meaning was not present in it, and that the proper human response was neither suicide nor invented religious comfort, but the deliberate, defiant choice to act as if life was worth living anyway. Sartre, around the same time, argued that human existence preceded any essence, that we were what we did, that freedom was a terrifying default condition we kept trying to escape. Rick and Morty, when you stand back from it, has lifted significant pieces of all four of those thinkers and remixed them into a cartoon. Rick himself, in his coldest moments, sounds almost exactly like a parody of Schopenhauer's pessimism. A man who has watched the will at work in the universe long enough to lose any interest in its products. The Citadel of Ricks, with its industrialized warehousing of Mortys, is, in its way, an illustration of Nietzsche's worry that the failure of meaning would produce mass-scale cruelty disguised as efficiency, that people would default to using each other as tools the moment a shared purpose was no longer available. Camus is in the kitchen scenes, in the basic insistence that the family eats dinner anyway, in the show's quiet refusal to either deny the absurdity of the universe or surrender to it, and Sartre is in the show's treatment of identity, in the Beth clones, in the Cronenberg substitutions, in the Roy helmet, in the constant suggestion that what you are is, at bottom, what you do, and that the substrate of doing is more shallow and more replaceable than you would like it to be. The show, of course, does not announce any of this. The show is a cartoon. The show is a comedy about a drunk grandfather and his anxious grandson and the things they break. The writers, in interviews, mostly talk about story structure and plot mechanics and animation budgets. The philosophy is in the show because of who wrote it. Dan Harmon has spoken publicly on a number of podcasts about his own struggles with depression and his own ongoing fascination with structures of meaning and storytelling. The other writers in the room across the years have brought their own readings. The show is the kind of program that gets made when a group of comedy writers who happen to have all read a few philosophy books in college are given a science fiction premise and a great deal of money. The philosophy lands by accumulation. The philosophy lands because the writers, episode after episode, keep choosing the bleaker option when they could have chosen the safer one. The philosophy is not the agenda. The philosophy is the residue of 100 small writing choices that, taken together, add up to a recognizable view of the world. What is interesting about the show as a philosophical artifact is that it has produced a generation of viewers who have absorbed these ideas without having to read any of the books. A teenager who has watched Rick and Morty across its entire run has, by the end of it, absorbed something close to a working model of Camus' absurdism, without ever having heard the word. They have absorbed the idea that the cosmic scale is indifferent. They have absorbed the idea that meaning is something you construct, not something you find. They have absorbed the idea that nihilism, taken seriously, leads to monstrous behavior, and that the only honest alternative is a kind of small, deliberate family-scale tenderness in the face of cosmic emptiness. That is, in its own way, a genuinely educational contribution to the culture. The show has taught a great many people, by stealth, a version of a difficult philosophical position that they otherwise would not have encountered. Whether they have all taken the right lessons from that stealth education is a separate question, and it is one the show itself has worried over publicly more than once. The way the show is worried about its own audience comes up in odd places. There is, in a much later episode, a side character described as a kind of avenging fan, somebody who believes himself to be the most important member of the audience and who shows up to demand that the show conform to his sense of what it should be. The show, when it puts this kind of character on screen, is openly thinking about the kind of fan it has produced. It is thinking about the fan who took the catchphrases and the cynicism and the science genius posture and built a personality around them. It is thinking about the fan who used the show as a license to look down on other people. It is thinking about the fan who, in the wake of one specific episode about a fast food sauce, briefly turned the show into a public relations problem for an actual restaurant chain in the real world. The show is allowed to find this kind of fan embarrassing without disowning him. And across multiple episodes, it has tried, sometimes clumsily, sometimes very sharply, to address the fact that part of its audience has misread it in exactly the direction it warned them not to. The show is not, in the end, an endorsement of Rick's lifestyle. The show is an extended, increasingly explicit warning about it. The show is, in many of its quieter beats, a kind of love letter to Beth and Jerry, to the suburban kitchen, to the unsexy work of staying in your life and trying to do it adequately. The argument is harder to hear because it is delivered through the loudest character. The argument is easier to miss because it is delivered between the laughs. But the argument is there, and it has been there since the pilot. The pilot opens with a boy being dragged out of bed by his grandfather and ends with the boy returning home to the small life his grandfather is teaching him to despise. The whole show is about which of those two states the boy will eventually choose. The whole show is about whether Morty, by the end of his story, will become Rick or will refuse to become Rick. The show has not yet given you the final answer to that question. The show may never give you the final answer. The show is, in its way, more honest for refusing. You can watch this question being tested in episode after episode of the later seasons. Morty saves his grandfather. Morty fights with his grandfather. Morty stops fighting with his grandfather. Morty, in one stretch, openly tells his grandfather that he is starting to enjoy the violence, that he is starting to feel less guilty when the bad guys die, that he is starting to find himself laughing at things that used to make him cry. Rick, watching this, has a small, tired expression. The show implies that Rick is afraid of what he has built. The show implies that the man who once seemed pleased to be raising a sidekick is now becoming aware that the sidekick is becoming a successor, and that the successor will inherit not only his skills but his pain. The show is staging, very slowly, the question of whether Morty will, in the end, do the thing Rick did, whether he will lose someone and become uncatchable, or whether he will be just lucky enough to keep the small life he has. The show, importantly, allows for both possibilities, sometimes within the same episode. It allows Morty to be the boy who is comforted by his sister when evening comes. It also allows Morty to be the young man who blows up a planet without flinching. It does not commit to either reading. By refusing to commit, the show is making the same argument it has been making across the whole run. People are not finalized, people are not either or. The same person can come home from a planet-leveling adventure and put his head on his mother's shoulder. The same boy who said nobody exists on purpose can also weep over a goodbye letter to a sentient bird. People contain both readings. In this way, the show is making one of its most underrated philosophical points. Nihilism and tenderness are not opposite ends of a personality scale. They are co-existing weathers inside the same person. The show argues, by living in this contradiction for the length of its run, that this is what being a human animal in an indifferent universe actually feels like from the inside. There is a side of the show's world building that fits this same theme, but that gets less attention because it sits underneath the louder stuff, which is the recurring presence of the Galactic Federation. The Federation, in the show, is the closest thing to a stable, ongoing political institution. It is a sprawling, multi-species, fascist-tinged bureaucracy that, in the second season, conquers Earth more or less by accident, installing a kind of bland, friendly, totalitarian normality across the entire planet. Children play in pristine parks. Adults work in jobs assigned to them. Jerry is finally employed in something that suits him. The takeover is presented as comically painless, which is, again, the joke. The argument the show is making is that fascism, in practice, often arrives not as a brutal occupation but as a slightly more orderly version of the life people were already living. The Federation feeds Earth. The Federation provides healthcare. The Federation makes the trains run on time. The Federation also, in the background, casually executes anyone who steps out of line, and routinely processes whole species through an assembly line of conformity. What is interesting about the Federation, for an argument about nihilism, is that it represents the show's most explicit institutional opposite to Rick's chaos. Rick, despite being the show's loudest figure, is essentially an anarchist. He hates structures. He hates authorities. He hates the idea that anyone should be allowed to tell him what to do. The Federation, by contrast, is structure all the way down. It is rules, it is paperwork, it is hierarchies, and the show, despite Rick's stated contempt, makes a quietly important point. The Federation, for most of its conquered subjects, is not noticeably worse than the world they were already in. Earth, under the Federation, becomes a slightly happier, slightly more boring place. What the show is suggesting is that the alternative to nihilism is not always freedom. The alternative to nihilism is sometimes simply a slightly larger structure pretending to give your life meaning, and that the structure, even at its most benign, is hard to distinguish from a soft totalitarianism. The show then has Rick, in the third season's opening episode, destroy the Federation by collapsing its economy through a counterfeit currency scheme. The world goes back to normal. Earth is, once again, a planet of chaotic suburbs in which the smartest people are also the loneliest. By ordering events this way, the show is suggesting that Rick's destruction of the Federation is not a victory in any meaningful sense. It is the choice of one kind of bleakness over another. The Federation was orderly and tyrannical. Earth, without the Federation, is disorderly and equally pointless. Rick prefers the second, but the show does not let him pretend the second is more meaningful. The second is just louder. The argument is, again, the same. There is no governance solution to nihilism. There is no system. There is no political program. There is only the question of which kind of meaninglessness you are willing to live inside. That argument, in turn, connects to one of the show's recurring side characters who never quite gets the philosophical weight he deserves, which is Bird Person's daughter. She is introduced late in the show, the product of Bird Person and the Federation spy who married him, raised in isolation, brought up to be a weapon. When she finally appears, she is a quietly furious young woman, trying to figure out what to do with a life she did not choose. The show, in its careful way, uses her to ask another version of the same question it has been asking through Morty. What does a person do with a life that was, in some sense, prepared for them by other people, for purposes they did not consent to? The answer the show gives, through her, is not encouraging. She joins her father in his exile on the cabin moon. She trains, she broods, she tries to figure out what she wants. The show implies that the project of figuring out what you actually want, when you have been raised inside someone else's plan, is the work of decades, and that most people do not finish it inside a human lifespan. That argument runs underneath the whole side plot. It is the same argument the show makes about Beth, the same argument it makes about Morty, the same argument it makes about Rick. All of them are working through the question of what they actually want, separated from the conditioning that other people have stacked on top of them, and none of them, by the end of the show, have a clean answer. There is, in the same general territory, an extraordinary episode the show built around the idea of memory erasure. The premise is that Morty, in his adventures with Rick, has accumulated a collection of memories that are simply too traumatic to keep, and that Rick has been quietly removing them from his head and storing them in jars in the garage. The episode takes the form of a clip show. Morty sits down and watches his own removed memories, episode by episode, and what fans had been hoping would be a fun grab bag of behind-the-scenes adventures turns out to be a slow slide into deeply upsetting territory. Memories of Morty killing aliens for no reason. Memories of Morty failing children. Memories of Morty making a deal with himself to be a worse person. The episode is structured as light entertainment until it stops being light entertainment, and by the end, Morty is openly weeping in the garage chair, surrounded by jars he is going to ask his grandfather to put back into his head, knowing that putting them back in will make him into a different person. The episode then twists. The argument the show makes inside the twist is one of its sharpest. By the end of the clip show, both Morty and Rick decide calmly that the best path forward is to wipe Morty's memory of the entire afternoon. They take a memory eraser. They use it. They forget that they ever discussed the jars. They go back to dinner. By ending the episode this way, the show is arguing that the things that define you are the things you remember, that the things you do not remember might as well not have happened, and that given a choice between integration and erasure, almost anyone will eventually choose erasure if it is offered. The show implies that this is, in fact, what people are doing every day without the help of any gadget. They are choosing, through habit and distraction and the slow forgetting of time, to let the parts of their lives they cannot integrate slip out of their working memory. The Mind Blowers episode is just a literalization of that quieter, more universal process. The show is saying that the entire architecture of an adult identity is, in some real sense, a curated highlight reel of memory in which the worst things have been allowed to fall out of view. The argument is uncomfortable. The argument is also probably correct. The same general territory of identity erosion is explored, in a more chaotic register, in a much earlier episode the writers titled, with a pun that fans simply remember as Total Rickall. The premise is that the family is being invaded by a colony of telepathic parasites that implant fake memories. The parasites cannot create unhappy memories, only happy ones. Every parasite, when it appears, brings with it a beloved family memory that everyone in the family suddenly remembers, as if it had always been part of their past. The episode rapidly escalates into a chaotic crowd of new characters, each one trailing a small parade of warm recollections. Uncle Steve, Mr. Beauregard, the loyal butler, Pencilvester the talking pencil. A whole brood of cheerful intruders the family is so glad to remember. The family loves them all. The show plays the chaos at a kind of frantic speed for most of its runtime. And then Rick figures out the test. Real memories include unpleasant ones. If you remember a person and you cannot recall a single time they let you down or angered you or disappointed you, that person is a parasite. The family then proceeds, calmly and over a long sequence, to execute every character in the house who has only positive memories attached to them, Mr. Beauregard, Pencilvester, down to the last, small, unpleasant one. The episode ends with the original 5 members of the household sitting in a room full of corpses, all of whom they had been loving with full sincerity 10 minutes earlier. That episode is, structurally, one of the most precise arguments the show has ever made about the relationship between memory and meaning. It says that the people you love are the people you also have grievances against. It says that a relationship without any unpleasant memory is, by definition, not a real relationship. It says that the test of whether someone is genuinely in your life is whether they have, at some point, made you angry or sad or disappointed or annoyed. That pure affection is not a sign of love, but a sign of imposture. The argument is, in its way, an inversion of the usual sitcom logic, which tends to celebrate frictionless bonds and treat conflict as a deviation from the norm. Rick and Morty, in Total Recall, simply states the opposite. Friction is the proof. Pleasant memories are cheap. Anyone, including a telepathic parasite, can generate pleasant memories. Real love is the thing that survives unpleasant ones. The show implies that this is why Rick and Beth, despite their dysfunction, are bonded. Why Beth and Jerry, despite the divorce, end up back together. Why Morty stays with Rick, despite the violence. They have unpleasant memories of each other. Those are the load-bearing memories. Everything else, the parasites can fake. There is another episode, fairly early in the run, that has aged into one of the most quietly devastating things in the show. And that is the one in which Rick turns himself into a teenager. The premise, again, looks like a goof. Rick wants to investigate something at Morty's school and he is too old to pass as a student. He builds a machine that transfers his consciousness into a young clone body. An athletic teenager he refers to as Tiny Rick. He goes to school, he plays sports, he sings in the talent show. He becomes the most popular boy in school. Summer and Morty become wildly more popular by association. The school adores him. The young body is healthy, attractive, exuberant in a way the original Rick has not been in decades. The bit is played mostly for fun. And then, slowly over the course of the episode, the show begins to drop hints that something is wrong. Tiny Rick is too cheerful. Tiny Rick is forgetting things. Tiny Rick is, in moments when no one is watching, drawing strange, anguished images. Tiny Rick is writing songs with weirdly desperate lyrics. The old Rick, trapped in storage in a tank in the garage back home, is screaming for someone to save him. The episode reveals that consciousness in the teenage body has become addictive. That the original Rick wanted to escape his own mind so badly that he is now resisting Summer's attempts to put him back into the broken old version of himself. The body he was born into is sick and lonely and out of fashion. The body of the teenager is, in every measurable sense, better. Summer eventually does force the transfer back, and the old Rick wakes up in his old body in the garage, surrounded by his own art and his own memories. And the show implies, without saying so, that what just happened was a relapse. That episode is, in retrospect, the show's most precise articulation of what addiction looks like inside a nihilist worldview. The reason Rick wanted to stay inside Tiny Rick is the same reason he drinks. The reason he drinks is the same reason he refuses therapy. The reason he refuses therapy is the same reason he chases Rick Prime. He is, at every level, trying to escape the experience of being himself. The teenage body was just a particularly efficient delivery mechanism for that escape. By ending the episode with Rick back in his original body and not visibly grateful, the show is making the point that nihilism is not really the opposite of an addiction. Nihilism is one of the addictions. It is a way of seeing the world that, once a nervous system has accepted it, becomes very hard to put down, in part because every alternative looks like delusion by comparison. The show implies that the actual difficult work, the work the show admires but cannot quite stage, is learning to be present inside the broken original body without needing to escape it. Rick has never done that work. The show has never pretended he has. You can read the entire run of the show as a careful study in different escape mechanisms. The drinking is one, the teenage body is another, the infinite portal gun is another. The hunt for Rick Prime is, even at its most morally satisfying, another. The constant motion is another. The science is another. The catchphrases are another. The fights with the family are another. Every episode is, in some way, Rick deploying a new escape. The episodes vary in the cleverness of the escape. The episodes vary in the entertainment value of the escape. The episodes do not vary in their underlying structure. Rick is always escaping. He is always escaping the same thing. He is always escaping the experience of being in a room with his own grief. And the show is implying very gently that you might recognize the structure from your own life. You might not have a portal gun. You might not have a teenage clone body. But you have your phone. You have your beer. You have your show. You have your scrolling. You have your 100 small daily devices for not being in the room with yourself. The show, in its way, is asking you to notice that and asking you to not be too hard on yourself about it. Because the smartest man in any of the multiverses is doing the same thing in a louder shirt. There is a different episode, structurally similar, in which Rick attempts to remove his negative feelings by separating them into a different body. The premise is that he has built a machine that will isolate the parts of him that experience guilt and self-loathing and self-doubt, and dump them into a small toxic clone. The plan is to leave the toxic clone behind and walk away from the negative emotions. The clone, predictably, refuses to be left behind. The clone, which is essentially Rick's depression with a body of its own, organizes its own takeover. There is a parallel storyline with Morty, undergoing the same procedure for his anxieties. The toxic versions of Rick and Morty try to merge into a single being who will replace the originals. The originals in turn have to retrieve their own negative emotions and reabsorb them in order to stop the takeover. That episode is, in its way, a textbook on how the show thinks about mental health, which is not as a problem to be cured, but as a set of weather patterns to be lived inside. The argument is that you cannot remove your guilt, that the attempt to remove it produces a worse version of the guilt that walks around outside your body, that the only path through is reintegration. The argument is that depression and anxiety and self-loathing are not external to you. They are part of you. They are the bookkeeping of a sensitive nervous system in a difficult universe. You cannot delete them. You cannot dump them into a clone. The clone is just you in a different shirt. The show implies that any therapy or self-help that promises to remove the negative parts of you is in the business of producing toxic clones, and that the only honest path forward is to sit down with the negative parts and have, in effect, a working relationship with them. That is, again, a strikingly mature position to take inside a cartoon that markets itself with catchphrases on t-shirts. The show, when you pay attention, has been doing the actual work of mental health writing for many seasons, mostly while disguising it as a science fiction joke. It is worth noting how often the show has used the format of the science fiction high concept to smuggle in something close to a therapy lesson. The Roy helmet is a meditation on whether your specific life is meaningful. The Vat of Acid episode is a meditation on whether your choices count. The Beth clone is a meditation on whether you can have the life you wanted without the one you have. The Tiny Rick episode is a meditation on whether you can run from yourself. The Toxic Rick episode is a meditation on whether you can excise the parts of you that hurt. The Mind Blowers episode is a meditation on whether you should remember the things that broke you. The Total Recall episode is a meditation on what makes love real. Even the Pickle Rick episode, behind the action movie sewer sequence, is a meditation on what it means to refuse to sit in a chair with your family. The show, at its best, is essentially a series of short stories about the basic problems of being a person, dressed up in costumes that make the basic problems look new and entertaining. That structure is also, by the way, why the show has been so well suited to sleep listening. The episodes are not random adventures, even when they look that way. The episodes are reworkings of the same questions, in different costumes, with different scenes. The format is reassuring on a deep level, even when the surface is upsetting. You always know, watching the show, that you are going to be asked the same questions you have always been asked, and that the show will not, in the end, give you a cheap answer. The cumulative effect over many seasons is a kind of long, slow, dark companion. You are not being lied to. You are being treated as an adult. The show is going through the same difficult problems with you, one episode at a time, refusing each week to flatter you with closure. That has, in the modern television landscape, become a relatively rare quality, and it is part of why the show has aged into a kind of cult comfort object. The brutality is the comfort. The refusal to lie is the kindness. It is worth talking briefly and carefully about the section of the fan base that misread the show in the loudest possible way, because that misreading is part of the cultural footprint, and it has shaped, in real ways, how the show is talked about. Somewhere in the middle of the show's run, a portion of the audience began to treat Rick and Morty as a kind of intelligence flex. The viewer who liked the show, the argument went, was demonstrating something about himself, about the rigor of his sense of humor, about the depth of his appreciation for the layered references in the writing. There was a brief but extremely visible online posture, much mocked since, that essentially said the show required a high level of intelligence to enjoy. The posture was, on the merits, embarrassing. The show is funny. The show is clever. The show is not actually inaccessible. You do not need a degree to follow it. The people who used the show as a credential were mostly using it the way people use any cultural object when they need a small flag of identity to wave at strangers. The reason this matters for an essay about nihilism is that the misreading was, in retrospect, exactly the kind of misreading the show itself had been worrying about. The misreaders took Rick as the hero. They took the contempt as the message. They took the catchphrases as the philosophy. They missed the long, patient counter-argument running underneath. They wore the cosmic indifference like a coat. They used it in some cases to justify a kind of social cruelty toward the people in their actual lives, on the grounds that the people in their lives were ordinary in the way Jerry was ordinary, and that ordinary, in the cosmology of the show, was something to despise. The show had been arguing the exact opposite for years. The ordinary, in the show, is the only thing that turns out to be load-bearing. Jerry is the most consistent moral figure on screen. Beth is the only character whose pain is treated with any consistent dignity. Summer, in the later seasons, develops into one of the show's most quietly competent characters, the one who keeps showing up at the kitchen counter for everyone else. The show was never about the contempt. The show was about the cost of the contempt. There was, in 2017, a brief incident in the real world in which a particular subset of fans descended on a fast food restaurant in pursuit of a discontinued sauce that the show had referenced in one of its episodes. The behavior was widely covered. The behavior was, depending on how you read it, either an obvious bit of fan enthusiasm or a small public embarrassment. The writers and the network, in the months afterward, talked openly about being uncomfortable with what they had inadvertently produced. There were public statements from people involved in the production asking fans to stop treating the show as license. The show itself in subsequent seasons leaned into a more self-aware mode that, among other things, mocked its own most aggressive fans. The argument the show seemed to be making in those moments was that nihilism as posture is not the same thing as nihilism as serious philosophical wrestling, and that the show was sorry for not being clear about which one it had been doing. That self-awareness has been one of the markers of the show's later years. It has aged, like many shows do, into a slightly more careful version of itself. The writing has not gotten any kinder. The set pieces have not gotten any safer. But the show has, more openly, engaged with its own status as cultural object, with the fan base it produced, with the responsibility it took on by being one of the few mainstream comedies willing to talk seriously about depression and meaninglessness and grief inside a science fiction format. The argument has shifted, subtly, from cosmic exploration to a slightly more domestic register. The show spends more time in its later seasons in the actual house. It spends more time with the actual family. It spends less time pretending that the multiverse is the destination. The argument seems to be that the show, over time, has had to put into practice the lesson it had been preaching, which is that the small kitchen is, in the end, the only sustainable place to live. The writers, having looked into the multiverse, have come home. You can see this most clearly in the way the show now writes Summer. In the early seasons, she was largely the punchline of being a normal teenage girl in a chaotic house. She wanted to fit in. She wanted to be popular. She was, by the show's measure, slightly shallow. In the later seasons, Summer has quietly become one of the show's strongest figures. She is the one who in several episodes, sees what is wrong with Rick before anyone else does. She is the one who, in a side adventure or two, gets a chance to be a hero on her own terms. She is the one who, when the family is breaking down, often calls the meeting. The show has been gently rewriting her over the years into the character who might actually grow up to be okay, who might inherit Rick's intelligence without inheriting his withdrawal, who might inherit Beth's competence without inheriting her bitterness, who might eventually be the version of the family who actually walks out of the cycle. The show does not flag this development loudly. It just keeps placing her at the kitchen table, where the load-bearing scenes happen, episode by episode, and letting her do more of the work. Watching Summer's slow promotion, in retrospect, is one of the most quietly hopeful things the show does. The show has spent so much of its energy on the question of whether Morty will become Rick that fans have sometimes missed the parallel question of whether Summer will become Beth, and whether either of those becomings is inevitable. The show implies, by giving Summer more screen time, more agency, more moments of competence, that the answer is not yet decided. The argument is the same argument the show always makes about people. They are not finalized. They are not destined. They are doing the best they can with the conditions they inherited. And sometimes, if they are lucky, the next generation does it slightly better. That is, in its way, a deeply anti-nihilist argument. It implies that the slow improvement of a family across generations is, even in a meaningless universe, a thing worth working at. The show does not say this out loud. The show says it by editing. You can see something similar in the way the show now writes Jerry. Jerry, in the early seasons, was almost entirely a punchline. He was the foil. He was the one Rick contemptuously walked past. He was the one whose mediocrity was the joke. In the later seasons, Jerry has become, by inches, one of the most reliable points of moral gravity in the show. He is the one who, when Beth disappears into her depression, sits with her. He is the one who, when Morty is in crisis, tries to be a present father. He is the one who, when Rick is being insufferable, says the obvious thing nobody else will say. The show has slowly let Jerry stop being a joke and start being a person. By allowing this rehabilitation, the show is suggesting that the contemptible character in the early seasons was never as contemptible as the contemptuous narration suggested. That the show's first impression assessment of Jerry was, in some sense, Rick's assessment of Jerry, and that Rick was, as he so often is, not the most reliable narrator in the building. The show has been quietly correcting its own initial framing, and that correction is itself a small argument about how easy it is to be wrong about a person when you let a louder person tell you who they are. The cumulative effect of these slow rewrites is that the show, after more than a decade, has produced one of the most quietly humane portraits of a damaged family in modern television. The Smiths, taken as a unit, are not a healthy family. They are not a model family. They are not a family in which everyone is doing well. But they are a family that, despite a great deal of horrifying evidence to the contrary, keeps showing up to the same kitchen, keeps eating the same dinners, keeps catching each other when the various crises get bad enough. By ending almost every season with another version of this family meal, the show is suggesting that the family meal is the smallest possible thing you can build against the multiverse, and that the smallest possible thing is what actually survives. Stars die, empires fall, versions of yourself walk into the garden and never come out. The pasta is still on the stove. The pasta has always been on the stove. The pasta is, in the show's reading, all you have. The pasta is, weirdly enough, enough. There is a different angle to all of this that does not get talked about as much, which is the relationship between the show's nihilism and its place in the history of adult animation. When the show began airing in late 2013, the existing template for primetime adult cartoons was, broadly, two-sided. On one side you had the family sitcom mode, The Simpsons, and its descendants, which was largely interested in domestic comedy with occasional flourishes of weirdness. On the other side you had the shock comedy mode, South Park, and Family Guy, and their imitators, which were largely interested in transgression for the sake of transgression. Rick and Morty did something new by taking the science fiction premise seriously enough to allow it to do philosophy while keeping the joke density of the shock comedy mode and grounding both inside the kitchen of the family sitcom. The synthesis was unstable and addictive. It produced a tone that almost no previous cartoon had been able to sustain. That tone, in turn, has been hugely influential. Almost every adult cartoon that has launched in the years since Rick and Morty's premiere has had to negotiate with the show in some way. Some have leaned harder into the philosophical mode. Some have leaned harder into the comedy mode. Some have tried to recreate the synthesis and discovered, somewhat painfully, how hard it is to balance the two. The show has, in this sense, become a kind of unwilling parent of a whole genre of animation that is interested in the same set of questions. Cartoons that ask what loneliness means. Cartoons that ask what families owe each other. Cartoons that ask what the smartest character in the room is supposed to do with the smartness. Cartoons that ask what you do when you find out the universe is large and indifferent. Many of those shows are, on their own terms, very good. None of them quite has the original tone. Rick and Morty, by being first and being committed, has set a bar that many similar shows are still trying to clear. You see the same influence in non-animated television and in feature film. The popular interest in the multiverse as a setting for serious drama across the last several years of mainstream cinema owes more to Rick and Morty than most studios will openly admit. The convention of treating the multiverse as a source of comedy and existential horror at the same time, the convention of using alternate selves as opportunities for grief rather than just for spectacle, the convention of treating the protagonist's depression as the actual narrative engine underneath the cosmic plot. All of these are tonal moves Rick and Morty was making for several years before they reached the multiplex. The show did not invent any of these conventions in isolation, but it normalized them. It made it possible for a mainstream audience to walk into a theater expecting a, say, multiverse story to be funny and sad at the same time, to be cosmic and intimate at the same time, to be unserious and devastating in the same breath. That tonal expectation is a real cultural achievement, and it is one the show is unlikely to ever get full credit for, because the influence is in the air rather than in any single film. The show has also, by accident or by intention, contributed to a broader cultural conversation about what television comedy is allowed to do with mental health. The convention, for most of the history of the medium, was that mental health storylines belonged in special episodes, that grief and depression and addiction were guest stars rather than main cast members. Rick and Morty has helped establish a different convention in which the grief is the main character, in which the depression is in every episode, whether the episode is about it or not, in which the addiction is in the background of every joke. That convention has been picked up by a number of dramas and comedies since. The argument has spread. The convention of treating mental health as a constant weather rather than a narrative event has become slightly more available across the medium. The show is part of why that is true, and that is, in its way, a genuine contribution to the culture, even if the show would, if asked, probably wave the credit away. What the show has not done, and to its credit has not pretended to do, is solve any of the problems it has been writing about. The show does not, at the end of its run so far, give you a clean philosophical conclusion. The show does not give you a happy ending in which Rick gets better. The show does not give you a tidy diagnosis of nihilism that can be packaged up and walked away from. The show, instead, just keeps going. It keeps showing up. It keeps making episodes. It keeps eating pasta. By simply continuing, it is making the argument that the right response to nihilism is not to defeat it, but to outlast it. You do not solve the problem of meaninglessness. You simply keep showing up to the kitchen for long enough that the question of solving it stops being the central question. You get older. You make more episodes. You watch the family change. You watch the voice change. You watch the writer's age. You watch your own decade move past you while the show is still on. The show is, by its longevity, demonstrating the position it has been preaching. Meaninglessness does not end. You just live in it. And sometimes when you have lived in it long enough, you notice that the thing you were calling meaninglessness has quietly turned into a life. That, in the end, is the deepest thing the show has to say about nihilism. And it is the thing the show says by being itself rather than by writing it down. The show has been on the air for over a decade. It has aired through real-world events the writers could not have predicted. It has aired through changes in the cast that fans never expected. It has aired through the slow growing up of an entire generation of viewers who started watching it as teenagers and now watch it as adults. The show has, simply by continuing, become a kind of fixed point in the long, ongoing conversation that those viewers are having with their own lives. The The pasta keeps cooking. The garage keeps generating gadgets. The Mortys keep getting dragged through doorways. The Beths keep splitting and recombining. The Jerrys keep being earnest. The Summers keep being slightly more present than anyone gives them credit for. The voice changes. The voice changes back, kind of. The voice keeps speaking. The show keeps speaking. If you are listening to this in the dark, with the lights low, on the third or fourth time you have tried to fall asleep to it, then in some real sense you are inside the same exercise the show has been describing all along. You are in your kitchen. Your kitchen in this moment is a bed. The multiverse in this moment is a phone or a laptop or a television playing soft animation in the background. You are not asked to find a final meaning for any of it. You are just asked to keep showing up. The show would, if it could, tell you that this is, in the end, what nihilism that survives looks like. It looks like a quiet night. It looks like a familiar voice. It looks like the same questions, asked again, in a slightly different costume. It looks like an old cartoon staying on past the point where most things would have stopped, and a viewer staying on with it. The Recall of this argument, if the channel will forgive the indulgence, is that companionship in the dark is the only refutation of nihilism that ever really worked. The argument was never that nothing mattered. The argument was always that, if anything matters, it is the small fact of someone showing up with you in the silence. There is one last set of moments in the show worth dwelling on before we close, and these are the moments the show gives over to its cosmic absurdists, the side characters who exist for a single beat or two, and who articulate sometimes accidentally the show's clearest statements of its own worldview. There is a recurring joke involving a sea creature who introduces himself as the Lord of the Sea, the chief enemy of police, and a man who answers to nobody, who shows up in a couple of episodes to lounge in the pool, drink mojitos, and casually inform the family that he and Rick used to be at war for reasons that no one will explain. There is Mr. Goldenfold, Morty's math teacher, who has, in various episodes, been shown to have a fantasy life so vivid and dark that the show keeps returning to it as a kind of running gag about the inner lives of seemingly ordinary suburban men. There is the recurring presence of beings who present themselves as gods or near gods, the alien who claims to have created the bowling ball, the various cosmic entities Rick has insulted or outwitted or just made a sandwich for in the past. The show has built up across its run a kind of cluttered casual pantheon of weird gods, and the joke about every one of them is that none of them are taken seriously by anyone in the cast. That casual contempt for the divine is one of the show's clearest philosophical signatures. The show has, in episode after episode, gone out of its way to introduce a being who in any other piece of science fiction would be a source of awe, and then it has had its protagonist dismiss the being as ordinary, fixable, beatable, drinkable with, or simply boring. By most accounts, the show is arguing that even the gods, when you actually meet them, are smaller than they advertised, that the awe was always partly a function of distance, that the closer you get to any apparent cosmic source of meaning, the more it turns into another bored man with a sandwich. The show extends this even to its own most dramatic device, the portal gun. The gun is, in any other show, a source of unending wonder. In Rick and Morty, it is mostly a kitchen tool. It is used to take out the garbage. It is used to dodge homework. It is used to swap one inconvenient situation for another. The cosmic spectacle is, in the show's reading, mostly the cosmic equivalent of a kitchen drawer. You open it, you take what you need. You close it, you keep going. There is, in a much later episode, a brief stretch in which Rick is asked in a moment of unusual stillness what he actually believes. The asker is a side character. The framing is light. Rick does not answer directly. He gives, instead, a small monologue in which he describes a universe that is mostly empty, that is mostly cold, that is mostly the absence of anything to want. He says, in his own roundabout way, that he has spent his life trying to find the part of it that is not those things, and that he has, in his own bitter judgment, mostly failed. He says, in a way the show does not underline, that the only times he has briefly forgotten the coldness are when he was distracted by another person. He does not say the word love. He does not say the word family. He does not say the word community. He says, essentially, that distraction by other people is the only known cure for the cold, and that everything in his life that has gone wrong in some version of refusing the distraction, or chasing it away. The monologue is delivered as comedy. The monologue is, on careful watching, the show's most explicit thesis statement. If you have watched the show carefully, you have seen variations of that monologue across the entire run, in different mouths, in different moods. Bird Person gives one. Beth gives one. Even Jerry, in his goofy way, has given a version of it. Summer, in one of her quieter scenes, has gestured at it. The show keeps planting the same idea in different soil. It keeps trying out the same argument in different costumes. The argument is that the cure for the cold of the universe is the warm proximity of other people, that the cure is small and unreliable and easily disrupted, and that the most damaging thing you can do to yourself is to drive away the warm proximity in pursuit of some larger meaning that the universe is not going to provide. Rick has, almost from the start, been a case study in driving the warm proximity away. The show, almost from the start, has been quietly asking you not to do the same. You can watch the show, in this way, as a long, patient demonstration. Here is what nihilism looks like when it is allowed to run unchecked. Here is what it does to your skin, to your liver, to your relationships, to your children, to your future. Here is what it does when it is given access to a portal gun. Here is what it does when it is given access to a teenage clone body. Here is what it does when it is given access to infinite worlds. The show has been showing you, episode by episode, a series of stress tests on a single intellectual position, and the position has failed every single test, and the show has refused to take the position off the table. The position has stayed. The position has aged. The position has, against the show's own arguments, simply persisted. Because positions like that do persist in actual nervous systems. The show implies, by writing this with such honesty, that you may know all of this perfectly well and still find yourself living some smaller version of the same loop. The show is not above you. The show is in the loop with you. The show is in the loop as you fall asleep. Even the smaller, more frivolous seeming episodes participate in this argument by sheer accumulation. The musical episode in which the population of Earth is briefly enslaved by an alien talent show. The horror episode in which the family's dreams are turned against them by a malevolent night being. The historical pastiche episodes in which Rick visits various caricatures of past eras. The body horror episodes in which someone is shrunk down and sent into another person's organs. The civic comedy episodes in which Rick is dragged through bureaucratic processes designed to humiliate him. None of these are the show's biggest statements. All of them are, in their way, contributing to the argument. They are saying, again and again, in different keys, that the universe is mostly indifferent, that it occasionally produces a small absurdity at your expense, and that the right response is neither outrage nor despair but a kind of weary readiness to keep going. The argument is, by the end, almost biological. The argument is in your bones after enough episodes. The argument is that, of course, none of this means anything. Now what are we eating tonight? The show's longevity is itself part of the answer to that question. It has been on the air long enough that the very fact of new episodes has become a small ritual in some viewers' lives. The release schedule has shifted over the years into something more like a slow drip than a regular event. But the basic fact that more episodes keep happening is, in its way, part of the show's argument. By continuing, the show is saying that the work of staying around is itself meaningful, even when the staying around is not pointed at any particular goal. Rick stays in the house. Morty stays in the family. The show stays on the air. Each of those is a small, unspectacular, ongoing act of presence. The cumulative effect of those acts is the only thing that ever resembles meaning in the universe the show has built. The show does not lecture you about it. The show just keeps doing it. Episode after episode, season after season, the kitchen lights stay on. When you sit with the show for long enough, the picture that emerges is not quite what fans say it is from the outside. From the outside, Rick and Morty looks like a nihilist comedy with a smart-mouthed protagonist. From the inside, after many seasons of episodes, Rick and Morty looks like a long, careful argument that nihilism is a true description of the universe and a terrible blueprint for a life. The show keeps making both halves of that argument at the same time. It refuses to abandon the first half because the first half is honest. It refuses to embrace the second half because the second half would make the show into a sermon. So it lives in the strange middle, where every joke is, in some sense, an admission that the cosmos does not care, And every quiet beat is, in some sense, an admission that you have to live anyway. The show holds the contradiction without resolving it. The show has been holding the contradiction for more than a decade. The show, it seems, intends to keep holding it. The viewer who falls asleep to the show week after week is doing something similar without thinking about it. The viewer is, in their own way, training their nervous system to hold both halves at once. The viewer is hearing, in the background, that nothing matters, and the viewer is choosing to be soothed by the hearing. The viewer is using a story about meaninglessness as a small ritual for going to sleep, which is, when you think about it, a fairly elegant practical solution to the problem the story is describing. If nothing matters, then bedtime stories about nothing mattering are as good as any other. If nothing matters, then a familiar voice describing buried Mortys and abandoned citadels is as good a lullaby as any prayer. The show has been quietly serving this function for years, for a very large number of people. It has been a kind of secular liturgy for the late-night anxious. It has been the background hum that makes the bedroom feel less empty. That, in its own way, is a form of meaning smuggled in through a back door labeled meaninglessness. The show would, if asked, probably laugh at the framing. The show would also, if asked, probably not deny it. There is something almost gentle about the show by this point in its run. It has earned the right to be tired in a way it could not have been in the first season. The jokes are still sharp, the plots are still ambitious, the violence is still cartoonish. But the show has, in its older state, allowed itself a few more pauses, a few more quiet 2 shots of people at the dinner table, a few more conversations between characters who are too exhausted to fight. The show has become a slightly slower version of itself, the way a person who once partied hard becomes a slightly slower version of himself when he is older. The nihilism is still there. The nihilism is just less loud about it. It does not need to demonstrate itself in every line. It is in the air of the room. The show, having spent more than a decade arguing for it, no longer feels the need to shout. It can simply set up another quiet conversation and let the quiet do the work. That is, in its way, the version of the show I want to leave you with as we close. Not the loud Rick. Not the catchphrase Rick. Not the cosmic adventure Rick. The quieter Rick of the later seasons, sitting at the kitchen counter at 3 a.m, drinking, not saying much, looking, for a moment, like a person who knows exactly how much he is failing the people he loves, and who does not know how to stop failing them. That is the truest Rick. That is the Rick the show has been working toward for the entire run. The smartest man in any of the multiverses, alone at his own counter, finally too tired to pretend the smartness is its own reward. The argument the show has been making for years has, by that point, landed in his bones. He knows nothing matters. He also knows he wishes things did. Those 2 pieces of knowledge live in him at the same time, and the show, by letting him be still for once, finally lets you see them living there. They have been living there since the pilot. If you have been listening to this all the way through, you may already be most of the way to sleep, which is, in its way, the kindest outcome the show could ever produce in its viewer. The nihilism has been a long, slow song, the way a lullaby is a long, slow song. The argument has been a kind of soothing, the way a heavy blanket is a kind of soothing. The show, despite its loud reputation, is, at the end, mostly a quiet companion in the dark, talking to you about a family in a small house in a corner of an infinite cosmos, telling you that the family is barely holding together, and that the small house is barely standing, and that the cosmos is mostly indifferent, and assuring you, in the same breath, that this is okay, that this is normal, that this has always been the deal, and that the kitchen, when you finally walk into it tomorrow, will still be there. When the show eventually ends, and it will eventually end, the thing that will remain is not the catchphrases, and probably not even the loudest single moments. The thing that will remain is the shape it pressed into a generation of viewers, the tonal expectation that a cartoon could be a kind of late-night philosophical companion, that a comedy could carry grief in its luggage, that a science fiction premise could be used to ask questions about mental health and addiction and family with a seriousness no previous primetime animation had quite earned. The show will be remembered as the place where a great many people first heard, in language they could absorb, the argument that the universe was indifferent and that you had to keep showing up anyway. It will be remembered as the show that made the catchphrase a cry for help, It will be remembered as the show that buried Mortys in the garden and asked you not to look away from the dirt. It will also be remembered, more quietly, as a show about a family that, despite all the cosmic noise, kept coming back to a kitchen. The Citadel will be remembered. The Cronenberg garden will be remembered. The pickle will be remembered. The catchphrase will be remembered. But what stays when you watch the show in order years from now? When you watch it on whatever screen you have left when you fall asleep to it for the 100th time, is the same image. A family at a table. A pasta dish in the middle. A grandfather drunk. A teenager hardening. A mother tired. A father trying. A sister slowly. Becoming the strongest of them. The universe outside the window. Infinite and meaningless. The window closed against it. The pasta still warm. That is the picture the show has been painting for over a decade. That is the picture it has been asking you to sit with as you go to sleep. That is the picture, in the end, that gets passed on. The nihilism is the weather. The kitchen is the home. The show, at its best, has been about the difference between the two and the small daily work of remembering which one you actually live in. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe and I'll see you in the next one.